even-handed, proportional, and wholly immune from the vagaries of politics. That's what we expect and demand and need from the Department of Justice and the FBI, and those expectations should be consistently exacting, because the power we give prosecutors and law enforcement is an awesome power. The power to prosecute, the power to charge, the power to indict is the power to impact reputations, it's the power to deprive people of their liberty, it is the power in some instances to even try to take the very life of a citizen. And we give police and prosecutors tremendous powers, and with those powers comes a corresponding expectation of fairness and just dealing. This Inspector General's report should conjure anger, disappointment, and sadness in everyone who reads it. This IG report lays bare the bias, the animus, the prejudging of facts by senior FBI agents and senior attorneys. And attempts to minimize and mitigate this bias are so antithetical to what we want and deserve in our law enforcement officers, and it's dangerous to the broader community. I've seen media efforts, and I've seen efforts from some, not all, but some of my Democrat colleagues to shift the burden of bias onto those impacted by that bias. That it is somehow the responsibility of those affected by bias to show how that bias negatively impacted them. What a dangerous shifting of the burden. It is not the public's job to prove the bias shown by the FBI did not influence decision-making. It is the FBI's job to prove to the public that this manifest bias was not outcome determinative. And bias and fairness cannot coexist. And that is why no lawyer seated up here today would ever allow a biased juror to sit on his or her jury. And no citizen would ever allow a biased police officer or judge to work on any matter of any significance. There is a presumption that bias is bad, and that is a presumption we should accept in nearly every single facet of life. As we read this report, we're reminded of Jim Comey's decision to hold a July 5th press conference and appropriate the charging decision away from the prosecutors. We see Jim Comey drafting an exoneration memo before important witnesses, like the target, were even interviewed. Ironically, this Inspector General has been accused of softening or watering down his report, when the reality is it was Jim Comey who softened and watered down his press release announcing no charges against Secretary Clinton. We see Jim Comey and Jim Comey alone deciding which DOJ policies to follow and which to ignore. We see Jim Comey and Jim Comey alone deciding whether there is sufficient evidence to support each and every element of an offense. We see Jim Comey and Jim Comey alone deciding whether to send a letter to Congress in the throes of a looming election. Now, his justification for this is that he did not have confidence in the objectivity of Attorney General Loretta Lynch. Whether it was her asking him to refer to this case as a matter rather than an investigation, or her meeting with Bill Clinton while Hillary Clinton was under investigation, or the matter he has alluded to but claims he cannot discuss publicly, clearly Jim Comey had lost confidence in the DOJ to handle the case in a way worthy of public trust. But that leads us to the one thing we did not see Jim Comey do, which was take any steps to spur the appointment of special counsel in the Hillary Clinton investigation. When he lost confidence in the Trump Justice Department, he memorialized private conversations, he leaked them, and he admitted he did so to spur the appointment of special counsel because he didn't trust the career prosecutors at the Department of Justice. When he lost confidence in the Obama Justice Department, he didn't make special memos. He didn't share them with his law professor friends. He didn't leak the information. He didn't lift a finger to get special prosecutor. Instead, he appointed himself FBI director, attorney general, special counsel, lead investigator, and the general arbiter of what is good and right in the world according to him. Now, one of the last times I spoke with Director Comey was in a committee hearing. We had a pointed exchange on what I thought was the FBI making decisions based in part on politics. And he, in his typically sanctimonious way, told me that he disagreed. He said the men and women of the FBI do not, quote, give a hoot about politics. Unfortunately, and I use that word intentionally, unfortunately, he was dead wrong. There were agents and attorneys at the FBI who gave a lot more than a hoot about politics. There's Andy McCabe, the former deputy director and acting director of the FBI, an agency which investigates and charges others for making false statements, himself accused of making false statements and showing a lack of candor. I think I recall, perhaps someone can correct me, but I think I recall some of my Democrat colleagues falling over themselves to offer a job to Andy McCabe when he was let go for making false statements and for a lack of candor. But those same colleagues apparently weren't hiring. They didn't have any openings when others in a related investigation called Russia were charged with the same offense. There were FBI agents and attorneys who decided to prejudge the outcome of the Hillary Clinton case before the investigation ended. I want you to let that sink in for a second. They prejudged the outcome of the Hillary Clinton investigation before the investigation ended, and these exact same FBI agents and attorneys prejudged the outcome of the Russia investigation before it even began. If prejudging the outcome of an investigation before it ends and prejudging the outcome of an investigation before it begins is not evidence of outcome determinative bias, for the life of me, I don't know what would be. That is textbook bias. It is quite literally the definition of bias, allowing something other than the facts to determine your decision. These agents were calling her president before she was even interviewed. They were calling for the end of the Trump campaign before the investigation even began. They were calling for impeachment simply because he happened to be elected. That is bias. And with all due respect, it's the FBI's job, not mine, to prove that bias can ever be harmless. Because I don't agree. I think bias is always harmful. So we'll spend today on a small in number but significant in leadership group of DOJ and FBI officials who had leadership and supervisory roles in the Clinton and Russia investigations and who failed to meet the basic expectations of fundamental fairness. But there are tens of thousands of FBI agents and DOJ employees who do meet our exacting expectations, and we will not be calling their names today, unfortunately, because we don't do IG investigations on agents and prosecutors who do their jobs with character and professionalism. To those agents and prosecutors who do the right thing, the right way, and for the right reasons, we'll get through this. It will be tough and it will be difficult, but we will emerge on the other side with a stronger FBI and a stronger Department of Justice because we have to. We cannot have a justice system that bases decisions on anything other than facts. To our fellow citizens watching at home, be unrelenting in your expectations of our justice system. Never lower those expectations. Respect for the rule of law is the thread that holds the tapestry of this country together. And it depends upon you having confidence in those you empower to enforce the law. And importantly, do not ever accept the notion that those victimized or impacted or negatively treated because of bias or prejudgment have any burden of proving harm. Bias is intrinsically harmful. It is the making up of your mind based on anything other than the facts. We use a blindfolded woman holding a set of scales to symbolize what we want in a justice system. And there is nothing more antithetical to justice than lowering that blindfold and making up your mind based on who is standing in front of you. That is not who we are. That is not what we should ever become. There is a saying in the courtroom, may justice be done though the heavens fall. You won't hear that saying in politics. You're more likely to hear, let's win at all costs, the heavens be damned. We can survive with politicians we don't trust. We can't survive with a justice system we don't trust. With that, I would recognize the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When we look back to the presidential campaign in 2016, there's one extremely troubling image we all remember very well. That is the image of Donald Trump and other Republicans chanting, "Lock her up, lock her up, lock her up." They were talking about Hillary Clinton using personal emails. And they demanded over and over again that she be jailed. But the Justice Department had already investigated. They had interviewed witnesses, reviewed documents, analyzed the law, and examined past charging decisions. At the conclusion of its investigation, the department disagreed with the Republicans. They did not charge Hillary Clinton with any crime at all. And the entire DOJ and FBI team on the investigation agreed with that conclusion. Of course, the Republicans refused to accept that conclusion. They wanted Hillary Clinton to be guilty. So they attacked the investigation. They said there must have been collusion with Hillary Clinton. They called emergency hearings over and over and over again. They insisted on reviewing documents and re-interviewing witnesses. And they demanded that the Inspector General conduct his own independent investigation of the FBI. Last week, the Inspector General issued his report, but it finds the same thing. It says, and I quote, "We found no evidence that the conclusions by the department prosecutors were affected by bias or other improper consideration." The report goes on, and I quote, "Rather, we determined that they were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practice," end of quote. So, the Republicans were wrong again. All their howling about lock her up was bogus. It was baseless. It was unsubstantiated. And now we have another report saying so. But again and again, the Republicans refuse to accept this conclusion. They still want Hillary Clinton to be guilty, even today. Now, they're going after the investigation of the investigation. They're going after the Inspector General's report issued last week. They want to review documents the Inspector General already reviewed and re-interview witnesses the Inspector General already interviewed. Some Republicans even want to investigate whether anyone tampered with the Inspector General's report or watered it down. They simply refuse to accept the Inspector General's findings. The Republicans point to some individual expressions of bias, and these are facts the Inspector General already reviewed. Instead, the Republicans are now tripling down, threatening to impeach Rod Rosenstein and Christopher Wray for somehow obstructing their efforts to get to the bottom of all of this. They had a big meeting on Friday, by the way, Friday night with Speaker Paul Ryan. No Democrats were invited, of course. But this weekend, Chairman Gowdy described some of it during a press appearance. Apparently, after reading the Inspector General's conclusions, House Republicans all decided that, and I quote, "The House of Representatives is going to use its full arsenal of constitutional weapons to gain compliance," end of quote, "with their never-ending demands regarding Hillary Clinton." At this point, I think it's crystal clear that the only answer Republicans will accept is that Hillary Clinton must be guilty. They will keep going on and going until they get that answer, even if the facts will never support it, and even if multiple independent reviews come to exactly the opposite conclusion. Republicans in Congress are only willing to use their full arsenal of constitutional weapons to attack Hillary Clinton or protect Donald Trump. Neither the Oversight Committee nor the Judiciary Committee has issued a single subpoena to investigate President Donald Trump or any other topic related to his administration, including the key moral and ethical issue of today, which is the president's new policy to separate children from their families. And so I ask the question, and it is a simple question: are we really going to sit here, 70 members of the Congress of the United States of America, in 2018, and have a hearing that just repeats the hearings the Senate had yesterday on Hillary Clinton's emails? We sent letter after letter, letter after letter, asking these committees to investigate the Trump administration's policy, which is now resulting in child internment camps. That's what I said, child internment camps. But we have gotten no response. Look, even if you believe people entered our country illegally, even if you believe they have no valid asylum claims in their own country, even if you believe immigration should be halted entirely, we all should be able to agree that in the United States of America, we will not intentionally separate children from their parents. We will not do that. We are better than that. We are so much better. We should be able to agree that we will not keep kids in child internment camps indefinitely and hidden away from public view. What country is that? This is the United States of America. We now have reports that parents are being deported, but the Trump administration is keeping their children here. 2018 in America. We do not need legislation. This is a policy, and understand this. This was a policy invented, implemented, and executed by President Donald Trump. And so, in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, we need you. Those children need you. And I'm talking directly to my Republican colleagues. We need you to stand up to President Trump. We need you to join us in telling him that we reject this mean policy. We need you to tell him to abandon this policy. We need you to remind him that this is the United States of America, and it is a great country. And we need you to stand up for those children. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
We are here to shed light on decisions that have terribly tarnished the reputation of our chief law enforcement institutions and undermined Americans' confidence in their justice system. Today, we will examine irregularities and improprieties in the FBI and DOJ's handling of two of the most sensitive investigations in the history of our country. And it all began with Hillary Clinton's mishandling of classified emails. The IG's report has spawned more questions and more theories about the FBI and DOJ's handling of the Clinton investigation. It confirms that Mrs. Clinton did, in fact, receive special treatment from the Obama Justice Department and FBI during their investigation. The American people often get tired of political infighting in Washington, D.C. So I want to ask a simple question. Why should Americans care about what we're talking about here today? I propose this answer: because our Constitution guarantees equality under the law. Americans expect that those with power and influence will not receive special treatment. But as the IG report describes, DOJ and FBI did not treat Mrs. Clinton like any other criminal suspect and did not follow standard investigative procedures in exonerating her. The IG found many issues with this particular investigation, as well as serious institutional issues. And while only telling half the story, we are still awaiting conclusions with respect to the allegations of surveillance abuse inside the FBI. The IG identified various corrective actions, including recommending 5 additional FBI employees for further review and possible disciplinary consideration. In a nutshell, the IG report details unusual actions taken by law enforcement officials who were sworn to uphold the Constitution impartially and fairly. They failed in that duty. Again, why should Americans care? The Department of Justice and the FBI are not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. Who is mentioned in the Constitution? The President and Congress. Yet a handful of individuals in these law enforcement institutions placed the constitutional institution of the presidency under attack during a heated election and mocked Congress's legitimate, constitutionally mandated oversight. Equality under the law is a core American value. Our laws are to be administered and enforced with impartiality. The IG report confirms that this was not the case in the Clinton investigation. To quote from the report concerning certain individuals assigned to the investigation, we found that the conduct of these 5 FBI employees brought discredit to themselves, sowed doubt about the FBI's handling of the mid-year investigation, and impacted the reputation of the FBI. Moreover, the damage caused by their actions extends far beyond the scope of the mid-year investigation and goes to the heart of the FBI's reputation for neutral fact-finding and political independence, end quote. I am only repeating what the IG found. Improprieties by the FBI and DOJ caused such far-reaching damage going to the heart of what is expected from agencies whose responsibility was to remain fair administrators of justice. This hearing and the IG's report underscores the importance of the ongoing joint investigation by the House Judiciary Committee and the House Oversight Committee into decisions made by the DOJ and FBI in 2016. To date, the committees have interviewed several key witnesses and reviewed tens of thousands of documents. While we appreciate the IG and his staff for a very detailed investigation, it is critical for the public to also hear what was not included in the report due to the IG's refusal to question, quote, whether a particular decision by the FBI and DOJ was the most effective choice, end quote. Here is what has been observed by these committees. Questionable interpretation by DOJ and FBI of the law surrounding mishandling of classified information. Foreign actors obtained access to some of Mrs. Clinton's emails, including at least one email classified secret. Director Comey appeared to have predetermined the exoneration of Mrs. Clinton at least 2 months before the investigation concluded. The Department of Justice determined any charge of gross negligence was off the table, reading an intent standard into the law that does not exist. Grotesque statements against then-candidate Donald Trump were made by top FBI officials, and they went so far as to say, "We'll stop Trump from becoming president." Indiscretions involving Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page were not handled appropriately at the time the FBI management learned of them, resulting in their continued assignment as key players on the Clinton investigation and the Mueller-Russia investigation. Mr. McCabe appears to have not been forthright with Congress during an interview conducted by the committees concerning his knowledge of meetings and actions taken by Mr. McCabe and his team. The FBI's top counterintelligence official was unaware of possible evidence indicating Mrs. Clinton's private email server had been penetrated by a foreign adversary and unaware of relevant legal process obtained during the investigation. Documents show significant criticism of Mr. Comey expressed by multiple current and former FBI agents. The FBI intentionally obscured the fact President Obama had communicated with Mrs. Clinton's private email address by editing Mr. Comey's final press statement, replacing the president with the euphemism senior government official. Finally, top FBI officials, including Mr. McCabe and Mr. Priestap, through their wives, had close ties to Democrat and Clinton-affiliated entities and should have seemingly been recused from the Clinton investigation. Public confidence in the impartiality of our law enforcement system is critical to ensure all are treated equally under the law. Fallout from the Clinton investigation, however, gives the impression those with money and influence are given lighter treatment than the so-called common person. Short-term damage to the FBI and DOJ's reputations is apparent. However, the IG and Congress's investigations will help to understand why certain deficiencies occurred during one of the most high-profile investigations in this nation's history. This hearing is a crucial step toward repairing law enforcement's reputation as an impartial fact finder and seeker of truth, and I look forward to the Inspector General's testimony today.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Inspector General Horowitz, for being here today. In the days since you released your report, Mr. Inspector General, I have been struck by the total disconnect between the Republican Party line and your actual findings. The report does not find, as President Trump continues to complain, that the FBI, quote, plotted against his election. The report also does not totally exonerate the President on the Russian matter, no matter how you read it. It does not give any reason to conclude, as the President's increasingly untethered attorney Rudy Giuliani argues, that, quote, Mueller should be suspended and honest people should be brought in, unquote, or that the Attorney General should violate his recusal and end the special counsel's investigation altogether. Nor does it suggest, as Chairman Goodlatte and Chairman Gowdy insist, that Hillary Clinton received special treatment from the FBI. The key findings in the report are quite simple. The Inspector General, quote, found no evidence that the conclusions by the prosecutors were affected by bias or other improper considerations. Rather, we determined that they were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practice, close quote. That sums up everything we're talking about. The report criticizes the FBI and its former leadership, but virtually every action criticized ultimately harmed the candidacy of Secretary Clinton and inured to the benefit of the candidacy of Donald Trump. And the report has nothing whatsoever to say about the ongoing work of the special counsel. President Trump, Rudy Giuliani, and some of my Republican colleagues are desperate to make that leap. Who wouldn't be in their position, with 23 indictments and the president's campaign manager in jail? But their argument is based on innuendo and not on the facts, and certainly not on this report. Now, I am not shy about my criticism of the former FBI director. When James Comey testified before the Judiciary Committee last year, I told him that he was wrong to have applied a double standard to the presidential campaigns. Speaking publicly and at length about the Clinton investigation, but refusing even to acknowledge the existence of the investigation into the Trump campaign. I also told Mr. Comey that he was wrong to have criticized Secretary Clinton after announcing that he would not charge her with a crime, not because of the content of the criticism, but because issuing that statement was simply not his job, as the report finds. It is also wrong, as well as against Department of Justice guidelines, for the investigative agency to criticize the subject of an investigation for uncharged conduct. It was totally unnecessary and wrong. The Inspector General's report describes both of these failings in detail. The report's analysis of Mr. Comey's July 5th statement reads in pertinent part, quote, in our criminal justice system, the investigative and prosecutive functions are intentionally kept separate as a check on the government's power to bring criminal charges. The report concludes that Mr. Comey's statement assumed an authority that did not belong to the office of the Director of the FBI. I am grateful for this important analysis, Mr. Horowitz. Unfortunately, sir, your key finding that the decision not to charge Secretary Clinton was based on an assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practice, and not on bias or improper consideration, is now subject to the treatment that President Trump and some of my Republican colleagues will give it. I mean, there was total bias, the President argued on the White House lawn just last week. What are we to make of this disconnect between what the report says and what the President and his allies say it says? Why is it that no matter how many times we litigate this question, House Republicans can think of nothing better to do than to endlessly investigate Hillary Clinton for the same conduct? Why is it that after half a dozen investigations found no wrongdoing at Benghazi, the majority spent millions of dollars on their own Benghazi Select Committee? And when that body found no wrongdoing either, why is it that the majority moved on to legitimize conspiracy theories about the Clinton Foundation and Uranium One? Why is it that after the Department of Justice and the FBI concluded it should not charge Secretary Clinton with a crime, rather than accepting the conclusion as we would in most criminal cases, the Judiciary and Oversight majorities launched an investigation into the Department of Justice and the FBI? Why is it that after you released this report, Mr. Horowitz, some of my colleagues seriously suggested that we open an investigation into your investigation of the investigation? Why is it that here and now, in June of 2018, we are still talking about Hillary Clinton's emails at all? I suspect it has something to do with the way Republicans have squandered their opportunity to govern and the consequences of abdicating that responsibility. House Republicans have done little or nothing to secure our next election from foreign attack, or to push back against the Attorney General's unprecedented refusal to defend in court the key protections of the Affordable Care Act, or to address an immigration crisis with anything other than a cruel and reactionary policy proposal that will never become law, and with persecuting children at the border. They don't even make credible arguments about Hillary Clinton's emails. I suspect that if the majority were actually motivated by the sensitivity of classified information in the Clinton case, they would have also said something by now about the highly sensitive Israeli operation revealed to Russian officials by President Trump, or about the way the President handles classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, or about the confidential human source whose identity was exposed recently while our colleagues tried to force the Deputy Attorney General to reveal his identity, or about the totally inappropriate, if not outright unlawful, dangling of pardons by the President and his attorney to those accused of participating in a conspiracy against the United States. No, too many of my Republican colleagues instead seem stuck at a perpetual Trump campaign rally, shouting "lock her up" with the rest of the crowd, hoping that the public won't notice how little they've accomplished with their time in the majority. I look forward to your testimony today, Mr. Inspector General. I hope our conversation can be the beginning of the end of this long preoccupation with Secretary Clinton. We have so many more important things to do. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York yields back. We are pleased to introduce our witness today, the Honorable Michael Horowitz, Inspector General for the Department of Justice. Welcome to you, Mr. Horowitz. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so I would ask you to do what you just did. Stand up, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? May the record reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. Mr. Horowitz, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy and Goodlatte, and thank you, ranking members Cummings and Nadler, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today regarding the report we released last week. Our 500-page plus report provides a thorough, comprehensive, and objective recitation of the facts related to the department's and the FBI's handling of the Clinton email investigation. It was the product of 17 months of investigative work by a dedicated OIG team that reviewed well over 1.2 million documents and interviewed more than 100 witnesses, many on multiple occasions. The review team followed the evidence wherever it led, and through their efforts, we identified the inappropriate text and instant messages discussed in the report. Additionally, the OIG's painstaking forensic examinations recovered thousands of text messages that otherwise would have been lost or been undisclosed. As detailed in our report, we found that the inappropriate political messages that we uncovered cast a cloud over the mid-year investigation, sow doubt about the credibility of the FBI's handling of it, and impact the reputation of the FBI. We found the implication that senior FBI employees would be willing to take official action to impact a presidential candidate's electoral prospects to be deeply troubling and antithetical to the core values of the FBI and the Justice Department. With regard to the decision to close the investigation without prosecution, we found no evidence that the conclusions by the prosecutors were the result of improper considerations, including political bias, but rather were exercises of those prosecutors' prosecutorial discretion, an exercise of their prosecutorial discretion, based on their assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practice. Our review also included a fact-based detailed assessment of certain specific investigative and prosecutorial decisions that were the subject of controversy. It was necessary to select particular investigative decisions because it would not have been possible to recreate and analyze every decision made in a year-long investigation. In examining these decisions, the question we considered was not whether a particular decision was the most effective choice, but rather whether the documentary and testimonial evidence indicated the decision was based on improper considerations, including political bias. This approach is consistent with the OIG's handling of such questions in past reviews when assessing discretionary judgment calls, and recognizes and respects the institutional oversight role of the OIG. Our report provides a comprehensive assessment of these decisions and of the mid-year investigation and details the factual evidence so that the public, Congress, and other stakeholders can conduct their own assessment of them. Within this framework, as to the specific investigative and prosecutive decisions we reviewed, we did not find documentary or testimonial evidence that improper considerations, including political bias, directly affected those specific investigative decisions, in part because the decisions were made by the mid-year team, by the larger mid-year team, or by the prosecutors. This determination by the OIG does not mean that we necessarily endorsed those decisions or concluded they were the most effective among the options considered, or that our findings should or can be extrapolated to cover other decisions made during the course of the investigation by the FBI employees who sent those inappropriate text messages. Conversely, we found the FBI's explanations for its failures to take immediate action after discovering the Wiener laptop in September 2016 to be unpersuasive, and we did not have confidence that the decision of Deputy Assistant Director Strzok to prioritize the Russia investigation over following up on the Wiener laptop was free from bias in light of his text messages. We also found that, in key moments, then FBI Director Comey clearly departed from FBI and department norms, and his decisions negatively impacted the perception of the FBI and the department as fair administrators of justice. Director Comey concealed from the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General his intention to make a unilateral announcement in July 2016 about the reasons for his recommendation not to prosecute former Secretary Clinton. His July 5th statement included inappropriate commentary about uncharged conduct, announced his views on what a quote-unquote reasonable prosecutor would do, and served to confuse rather than clarify public understanding of his recommendation or what the prosecutors had assessed in terms of the evidence. In late October, he again acted without adequately consulting department leadership and contrary to important department norms when he sent a letter to Congress announcing renewed investigative activity days before the election. There are many lessons to be learned from the department's and the FBI's handling of the Clinton email investigation. But among the most important is the need to respect the institution's hierarchy and structure and to follow established policies, procedures, and norms, even in the highest profile, and most challenging investigations. No rule, policy, or practice is perfect, of course, but at the same time, neither is any individual's ability to make judgments under pressure or in what may seem like unique circumstances. When leaders and officials adhere to bedrock principles and values, the public has greater confidence in the fairness and rightness of their decisions, and those institutions' leaders better protect the interests of Federal law enforcement and the dedicated professionals who serve us all. By contrast, the public's trust is negatively impacted when law enforcement officials make statements reflecting bias, when leaders abandon institutional norms and the organizational hierarchy in favor of their own ad hoc judgments, and when the leadership of the Department of Justice and the FBI are unable to speak directly with one another for the good of the institutions. Our report makes 9 recommendations, most of which can be tied together through a common theme: that the FBI and the Justice Department remain true to their foundational principles and values in all of their work. That concludes my prepared statement. I'd be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Inspector General. There's a text exchange between FBI lawyer Lisa Page and FBI agent Peter Strzok from August the 8th of 2016. In that text exchange, Lisa Page wrote, "Trump's not ever going to become president," right with a question mark, and then right with a question mark and an exclamation point in case anybody reading it may have missed the point of her emphasis. Peter Strzok responded, no, he's not. We'll stop it. Do I have that text exchange right?
You do?
Now, Lisa Page was an FBI lawyer who worked on the Clinton email investigation.
That's correct.
Did she also work on the Russia investigation?
She did.
How about the Mueller special counsel team?
She did for a period of time.
All right, so we're 3 for 3 on her working on the 2 most important Bureau investigations in 2016 and beyond. Now, is this the same Lisa Page that Andy McCabe used to leak information to a news outlet?
She was his special counsel, and as we indicated in our earlier report, she was the individual through whom he provided that information.
Wasn't there also a text about an insurance policy in case Trump won in a meeting in Andy's office? She was part of that text string too, wasn't she?
Correct. That was on August 15.
All right, so this August 8 text was not the only time FBI lawyer Lisa Page was able to use the text feature on her phone. This is the same Lisa Page who admonished the agent interviewing Hillary Clinton not to go into that interview loaded for bear because Clinton might be the next president. And it's the same Lisa Page who said Trump was loathsome, awful. The man cannot become president. Clinton just has to win, and that Trump should go F himself. Now, most of those comments were before the Clinton investigation was over. And we are somehow supposed to believe that she did not prejudge the outcome of that investigation before it was over. She already had Hillary Clinton winning. I don't know how you can win if you're going to wind up getting indicted and or plead guilty or be convicted of a felony. So, I think we understand the first half of that text pretty well. She didn't want Trump to win, and she wanted Clinton to win. Now for the response. Senior FBI agent Peter Strzok wrote, no, he's not. We'll stop it. Now, I think this is the same Peter Strzok who worked on the Clinton email investigation. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Same Peter Strzok who not only worked on the Russia investigation when it began, but was one of the lead investigators at the inception of the Russia probe. Do I have the right Peter Strzok?
That's my understanding.
Now, is it the same Peter Strzok who was put on the Mueller special counsel team?
Yes.
All right, same Peter Strzok. And this is not the only time he managed to find the text feature on his phone either. This is the same Peter Strzok who said Trump is an idiot, Hillary should win 100 million to 0. Now, Mr. Inspector General, that one is interesting to me because he's supposed to be investigating her for violations of the Espionage Act at the time he wrote that in March of 2016. He's supposed to be investigating her for violations of the Espionage Act, and he can't think of a single solitary American that wouldn't vote for her for president. I mean, can you see our skepticism? This senior FBI agent not only had her running, he had her winning $100 million to nothing. So what if they'd found evidence sufficient to indict her? What if they had indicted her? Is this the same Peter? He wasn't part of the interview of Secretary Clinton, was he?
He was present for the interview.
Huh. So 4 months before that interview where he was present, he's got her running and winning $100 million to zero. And it's the same Peter Strzok who wrote The Bigoted Nonsense of Trump. Trump's a disaster. I have no idea how destabilizing his presidency would be. He wrote F Trump. Trump is an effing idiot. On the prospects of Trump winning, he wrote, this is an effing terrifying. In addition to seeming to like the F word, I think we have the same FBI agent, Lisa Page, and the same FBI agent, Peter Strzok, working on the Clinton email investigation, the Russia probe, and on Mueller's team. So we have the right text and we got the right people. I want to make sure we have the chronology right. July 5th, 2016, Comey announces no charges for Secretary Clinton, right?
Correct.
July 28th, 2016, the FBI initiates a counterintelligence investigation into Russia and the Trump campaign. And Strzok is not only on that Russia investigatory team, he's actually leading it. So that's 3 weeks after Clinton is exonerated by Comey. Strzok is leading an investigation into Russia and possible connections with the Trump campaign. That's on the 28th of July. Now on the 31st of July, 3 days after the Russia investigation began, Strzok wrote, "Damn, this feels momentous." The other one did too, but this was to ensure we didn't F things up. This one matters because it matters. And if you happen to not know how important it is, he went ahead and put matters in all caps in case you happen to not focus on the importance of why this matters. Now, her investigation was just to make sure they didn't F things up. This one, we're 3 days into it, Inspector General Horowitz, 3 days into an investigation, but this one really matters. I wonder what he meant by saying the purpose of the Clinton investigation was to make sure they didn't F things up, but the Russia investigation, nah, that one was different. That one really mattered. You know, it almost sounds, Inspector General Horowitz, like they were going through the motions with the Clinton investigation. But boy, they sure were excited about the Russia one. Then we get to August 6th. This is less than 10 days after the Russia investigation begins, and Page says, you are meant to protect the country from that menace. And then we get to August 8th, 2016. Less than 2 weeks after the Russia investigation even began, the lead FBI agent says he will stop Trump from becoming president. This is 2 weeks into an investigation, and he's already prejudged the outcome. And we're somehow supposed to believe that that bias was not outcome determinative. I can't think of anything more outcome determinative than my bias against this person I'm investigating with only 2 weeks worth of investigating. I have already concluded he should not be the president of the United States. And then we get to August 15th, just over 2 weeks into the Russia investigation. Strzok says, I want to believe the path you threw out, that there's no way he gets elected, but I'm afraid we can't take that risk. It's like an insurance policy. Mr. Inspector General, that is 2 weeks into an investigation, and he is talking about taking out an insurance policy because he can't fathom the target of his investigation possibly becoming the president. So I want to go back to the no, he's not going to be president, we'll stop it. What do you think the it is in that phrase, we'll stop it?
Oh, I think it's clear from the context. It's we're going to stop him from becoming president.
That's what I thought too. Now, I wonder who the we is in the we'll stop it. Who do you think the we is?
Well, I think that's probably subject to multiple interpretations.
We'll
whether
see if
the
we can
is
go
the
through a
two
couple
of
of
them,
them.
or the broader, or a broader group beyond that.
I mean, it's hard to fathom a definition of we that doesn't include him. So we know he's part of we. You could assume that the person he's talking with is FBI attorney who also happens to be working on the Russia investigation. She may be part of the we. But I wonder, Inspector General, did you find any other FBI agents or FBI attorneys who manifest any animus or bias against President Trump?
We did.
How many?
We found 3 additional FBI agents, as we detail in the report.
And were any of them working on the Russia
I'm
investigation?
sorry, let me just correct, 2 agents and 1 attorney.
2 other agents, 1 other attorney. Were they working on either the Russia investigation or the Mueller probe?
I believe 2 of the 3 were, but I'd have to just double check on that.
Okay. Now, Bob Mueller was named special counsel on May the 17th, 2017. 1 day later, Mr. Horowitz, 1 day later, Peter Strzok is back on his phone texting some more. For me, in this case, I personally have a sense of unfinished business. I unleashed it with the Clinton email investigation. Now I need to fix it and finish it. Fix what?
Well, there is outlined in the report what Mr. Strzok's explanation for
Oh, I know what he
this
said.
was.
I'm asking the guy who had a distinguished career in the Southern District of New York and had a distinguished career at the Department of Justice. Would you rather cross-examine Peter Strzok on that explanation, or would you rather direct the examination on that explanation?
Probably cross-examine.
That's what I thought. How about finish it? When he said, I unleashed it, now I need to fix it and finish it. What do you think he meant by finish it?
I think in the context of the emails that occurred in August and the prior August that you outlined, I think a reasonable explanation of it, or a reasonable inference of that, is that he believed he would use or potentially use his official authority to take action.
But this is 24 hours into him being put on the Mueller probe. There's no way he possibly could have prejudged the outcome of the investigation. Maybe he did. Maybe that's the outcome determinative bias that my Democrat friends have such a hard time finding. Inspector General Horowitz, if one of your investigators talked about Lisa Page and Peter Strzok the way they talked about Donald Trump, would you have left them on the IG investigation?
No.
Did you ever have an agent when you were a prosecutor with this level of bias?
You know, as I've laid out here, I thought this was completely antithetical to the core values of the department and extremely serious.
Can you speak up, please?
I'm sorry.
I heard you, but you can say it where Mr. Nadler can hear you too.
You know, my view of this was that this was extremely serious, completely antithetical to the core values. In my personal view, having been a prosecutor and worked with FBI agents, I can't imagine FBI agents suggesting even that they might use their powers to investigate, frankly, any candidate for any office.
Well, I can't either. And let me ask you this in conclusion. I think you've already, you laid out in your opening that Peter Strzok's obsession with Donald Trump and the Russia investigation may have led him to take his eyes off of the Wiener laptop and in a notably ironic way caused Jim Comey to be a little bit later in sending those letters to Congress. So that is one example of outcome determinative bias. But I got to ask you, you used to be in a courtroom. You were on the side of the United States and you worked for the Department of Justice. If someone is prejudging the outcome of an investigation before it ends, and someone is prejudging the outcome of an investigation before it even begins, what is more textbook bias than prejudging this investigation before it's over and this one before it begins? I am struggling to find a better example of outcome determinative bias than that. So what am I missing?
Well, I think certainly with regard to the Russia investigation you mentioned, as you know, we are looking at that in an ongoing way. With regard to the Clinton email investigation, I think as we lay out here and go through it, we looked at text messages, emails, documents to try and assess whether the specific decisions that we were asked to look at and then the ultimate prosecutorial decision were impacted by Strzok, Page, and the others' views. And what we ended up finding, particularly as to the prosecutor's decision, was that was a decision they made exercising their discretion on their view of the policy, the law, and the facts as it was found. We've laid that out, and in our view, we didn't find or see evidence that the prosecutors were impacted by that bias. But as I mentioned in my opening statement, the idea here was to put out the facts for the public, members of Congress to see, and so that folks who want to take a look at those issues obviously can assess them themselves.
Well, my time is up. I hope one of my other colleagues will explore that, because the explanation I've heard is that the failure to prosecute was predicated upon their belief that there was not sufficient evidence of intent on her behalf. And I don't know where in the hell you would go to find better evidence of intent than interviewing the person who actually was doing the intending. And when you make up your mind that you're not going to charge someone, and you make up your mind that you need to not go in loaded for bear, and then you read the 302 and there's not a single damn question on intent, it is really hard for those of us who used to do this for a living to not conclude they'd made up their mind on intent before they even bothered to talk to the single best repository of intent evidence, which would be her. With that, I would
Mr. Chairman, may I make an inquiry? Mr. Chairman, in order to prepare our questions, could I have your guidance on how much time each member is to be allowed?
5 minutes, and Mr. Cummings can have the amount of time he thinks is necessary. The other members will have 5 minutes. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Horwitz, for your work, and I want to thank all of the IGs. We have always been, both sides of the aisle, impressed with your efforts, and to your staff, I thank you. Mr. Horwitz, I want to focus on whether Secretary Clinton received, as some of my colleagues put it, special treatment from the FBI and DOJ. On the decision not to prosecute Secretary Clinton, your report found, and I quote, "We found no evidence that the conclusions by the prosecutors were affected by bias or other improper considerations. Rather, we determined that they were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practice. We want justice department officials to make their decisions based on the facts, the law, and the past department practices." Isn't that correct? Is that accurate?
That's correct.
And your report also concluded that the FBI team interpreted and applied the law to Secretary Clinton in a way that was, and I quote, "consistent with the department's historical approach in prior cases under different leadership, including in the 2008 decision not to prosecute former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales for mishandling classified documents." Is that correct?
That's correct.
But Director Comey did apply a double standard to Secretary Clinton in a way that helped Donald Trump and severely hurt Secretary Clinton. Director Comey followed the department policy and kept secret from the American people the FBI's investigations of the Trump campaign in Russia, but repeatedly ignored department policy and released information about Secretary Clinton. Regarding Director Comey's July 5th, 2016 public statement about his recommendation not to charge Secretary Clinton, your review found, and I quote, Comey's unilateral announcement was inconsistent with department policy and violated long-standing department practice and protocol by, among other things, criticizing Clinton's uncharged conduct. Can you explain why the department has a policy against criticizing the uncharged conduct of an individual?
Certainly. The department, and actually one of the things that was interesting in the report is we found that it's a norm that's accepted, but there actually isn't a policy that explicitly states that, so that is one of our recommendations. And I would as we talk about this issue, the reason you don't speak about uncharged conduct, there are many, but it is fairness to the individual. If an individual isn't going to be charged with criminal conduct or wrongdoing, you don't speak about it. You speak in court. That's what we've been trained from day one as prosecutors and anybody who's worked in the Justice Department. Doing that publicly not only tarnishes an individual, but raises questions of the fairness of justice and applications of various principles, as you indicated. Indeed, as we point out here, while there isn't an explicit policy at the department about not speaking on uncharged conduct in a case where you don't charge any criminal activity, there actually is language that prohibits department prosecutors from speaking about uncharged conduct of co-conspirators. And so, in other words, where there is in fact a charge of criminal wrongdoing and a conspiracy, and some individuals in the conspiracy are charged and some individuals aren't charged, and that can happen because there is stronger evidence against some than others, department policy says you can't speak about the uncharged individuals even though you believe they committed a crime. And yet there is no corresponding policy which is on where there are no charges, which is why we make that recommendation in this report.
I see. You also found that Director Comey's October 28, 2016 letter to Congress about Secretary Clinton, and I quote, originated with Comey's elevation of maximal transparency as a value overriding, for this case only, the principles of stay silent and take no action that the FBI has consistently applied to other cases. Now, Mr. Horowitz, one of those investigations where Director Comey decided to follow department policy and practice and keep silent was the Russia investigation into allegations of collusion with the Trump campaign. Is that accurate?
It is, and I'll add he also had that policy with regard to the Clinton Foundation.
And so, so say that again. Explain that, what you just said.
So there were two investigations he declined, as we lay out here, to speak about. One was the Russia investigation, and one was an on.
And report on FBI that wasn't about him. And, quote, Republicans want to shut Mueller down over a report that isn't even about him, end of quote. President Trump stated last Friday, and I quote, if you read the IG report, I've been totally exonerated, end of quote. Mr. Horowitz, my copy of your report must be missing a page, or a few pages. Did your investigation examine whether President Trump's campaign colluded with Russia to impact the election, or whether the president obstructed an FBI investigation?
Our report was focused on the Clinton email investigation, and the only place where it touches the Russia matter is with regard to the text messages and then the October decision about the Wiener laptop.
The president also said, and I quote, the Mueller investigation has been totally discredited, end of quote. I don't see that in your report anywhere. Maybe I missed it. Does your report reach any conclusions about the validity or credibility of Special Counsel Mueller's investigation?
As we noted in the report, it relates to the Clinton email investigation, and the Russia matter was not part of this review other than with the exception I mentioned earlier.
Now, Rudy Giuliani, President Trump's personal attorney, said, and I quote, tomorrow Mueller should suspend his investigation, end of quote. Does your report recommend that the special counsel suspend his investigation?
We don't address issues with regard to the special counsel.
Mr. Giuliani also said, and I quote, the IG report basically tells you that both prongs of the Mueller investigation are either corrupt or answered, end of quote. Did your investigation determine that the special counsel's investigation is corrupt?
Yeah, as I said, our report was concerning the Clinton email investigation.
Well, did your investigation answer the questions being considered in special counsel Mueller's probe?
Same answer.
The conclusion in your report state, and I quote, and I will finish with this, Mr. Chairman, through the collective efforts of generations of FBI employees, the FBI has developed and earned a reputation as one of the world's premier law enforcement agencies. The FBI has gained this reputation in significant part because of its professionalism, impartiality, non-political enforcement of the law, and adherence to detailed policies, practices, and norms. Did you find that the FBI as an institution is corrupt, politically biased, or untrustworthy?
We didn't reach the larger question of, how this broadly affected the FBI beyond noting that, in fact, this kind of conduct undermines that credibility, impacts people's perceptions of the FBI in a way that should never have happened, and is very concerning for all the reasons I think everybody cares about the fair administration of justice.
And I listened very carefully to Chairman Gowdy's questions, which were excellent. And the cloud that you talked about with regard to Ms. Page and Straw and the others that you mentioned, how did the method that you used to figure out that their opinions did not have a negative impact, or inappropriate impact on this investigation?
So what we did was,
Because that is a crucial question. I mean, in fairness to all, I think it's important that be addressed. Go ahead.
yeah, absolutely, Congressman. I think it is very important because, as we've talked about, the language, the messages, the appearance, the implication that any law enforcement officer would be willing to use their authority to impact any election, any individual, whatever side that person is running on or running from, is so antithetical to the core values of justice and the FBI. And so the question we looked at were the comments of the 5 individuals we identified here in looking at their various messages, how did those impact the specific decisions we looked at, and then the prosecutor's decision ultimately? Because obviously the prosecutors are the one, despite what Director Comey said publicly, were responsible for making the ultimate decision on whether to charge or not charge. What we did was we questioned witnesses closely. We looked for all the documentary evidence we could, and we looked at the specific decisions. As to the specific decisions we outline here in the report, they were either the result of larger team decisions that were not exclusively within the domain of the individuals who had very troubling messages, or were prosecutors' decision and not the decisions of these individuals. And we also noted that at least for some of these decisions, the individuals are actually seeking more aggressive approaches than the prosecutors were in some regards. So we looked at all of that evidence, and we assessed whether on that record we could make a finding that bias turned into action by those other individuals. And we didn't believe there was evidence to reach that conclusion. And as to the prosecutor's decision, it was the prosecutor's decision. And folks can debate and discuss, and there's clearly been a fair amount of it, on whether the precedent and the current and the assessment here on the application of the gross negligence provision was an appropriate application of that provision. But that's a decision that the prosecutors made based on their judgment, as you indicated, looking at
Just
the
the
record
last
over
question.
time.
Let me ask you this. In coming to that conclusion that you just talked about, was there, because it seems like we're having an investigation of the investigation of the investigation, but so I ask you this, your staff, the people that you work with, your IG assistants, and
Right.
were you all solid behind what you just said, or did you have a lot of you had people saying, nah, you know, like a jury, half of them?
You know, the great thing about having a large team like we had working on this is, much like I've done in other reports, Fast and Furious and others, we sit in a room, sort of hash it out, exchange ideas, but I'm comfortable saying this is the conclusion of all of us in the IG. I obviously am the one who has to and is the one responsible for ultimately issuing this, but that was our team conclusion of it. But I hasten to add, we understand and recognize and state explicitly on how serious the conduct was and how it cast a cloud over the whole investigation. I don't think that can be lost either.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Horowitz, welcome. We know from the reports surrounding former Deputy Director McCabe's termination that the Department of Justice at high levels sought to terminate the Clinton Foundation investigation. We also know that you found communication between Secretary Clinton and President Obama. During your investigation, did you seek access to communications from the Department of Justice?
Yes, we did.
What about former Obama White House officials?
We saw department records and department information. We have, in the past, when we've sought White House records, and this is true of administrations going way back, it's been made clear to us that the Executive Office of the President does not provide records to inspectors general of agencies. So we would look for them if they were incoming to the department, and those would be records that we would seek and obtain, but we don't have authority over any other agency outside government. I'm sorry, the Justice Department.
Did you seek to interview any officials at the White House? The Obama White House.
I would have to go back and ask the team whether we sought interviews.
Dennis McDonough?
I don't believe so.
Valerie Jarrett?
I don't believe so.
How about the President himself?
No, we did not.
Right. Neither the Department of Justice, would you have liked to have had that information if you could get access to it?
I'd have to think about that and talk with the team, frankly, about that and how they would view that.
Neither the Department of Justice nor the FBI are mentioned in the Constitution. However, each institution has engaged in repeated stonewalling of Congress's constitutionally mandated oversight. The infamous text from Peter Strzok saying, "We will stop President Trump from taking office," which we received on the day of your report's release, is a prime example. This text was revealed to you late in your interview as well, as I understand. Do you believe this text shows political bias?
I think, as we found, it clearly shows a biased state of mind.
And if so, do you believe the political bias shown by this text had an effect on the initiation of the Russia investigation?
I think, as you know, Mr. Chairman, that's a matter we've got under review and are looking at right now.
More to be determined on that.
More to be determined.
But the time proximity, as Mr. Gowdy pointed out, is significant.
Correct. In fact, there are these other text messages in roughly the same time period.
You were an assistant United States attorney for 8 years. Is that correct?
Correct.
In that time, did you ever charge any Espionage Act case or a case under Section 793F?
I did not.
I'm trying to understand more about the seeming need for intent in this statute. Of course, as some have noted, people never intend the bad things that happen due to gross negligence, right?
Correct.
So some courts have stated that willful blindness satisfies the requirement of knowledge. For example, this happens in cases where a defendant is transporting a package containing narcotics. Courts have never allowed the defendant to claim he didn't know what was in the package because he should have known and exercised criminal recklessness by failing to determine what was in the package. In your opinion, as a former prosecutor, isn't a similar analysis appropriate here?
I'm going to demur on what I would have done as a prosecutor or my views as a former prosecutor. I will say what was explained to us in terms of intent was actually really knowledge. The focus was largely on the fact that these documents that were classified weren't clearly marked as classified.
Well, didn't Mrs. Clinton, as Secretary of State, having the authority not only to read all levels of classified documents, but also to classify documents herself, didn't she have a duty to determine whether the unclassified server she used to transact all her official business was moving classified information?
I think it's fair to say there's a responsibility on senior officials to understand and know what classified information may be present.
Wasn't that the least amount of care we should have expected from her with information that could cause serious harm to our national security?
I think I'm going to rely on the evidence that we had here in our review, which was to look at what the prosecutors made as an assessment. And as we describe here, their view was, unless it was marked, unless there was clear knowledge, they believed that it would be inconsistent with past practice and how they would look at this provision and therefore not charge it.
Following the 2016 election, many of my Democratic colleagues called for the resignation or termination of former FBI Director James Comey for his mishandling of the Clinton investigation. Curiously, these same colleagues cried foul when President Trump, upon the recommendation of Department of Justice Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, did in fact terminate Comey. For instance, on November 14, 2016, one of our Democratic Judiciary Committee colleagues told CNN's Chris Cuomo that Comey should be fired immediately, and President Trump ought to initiate an investigation into his actions. Conversely, on May 9, 2017, that same Democrat made a complete U-turn and stated that, quote, the firing of FBI Director Comey by President Trump is a terrifying signal of this administration's continued abuse of power on so many levels, end quote. Additionally, following the 2016 election, another of our Democratic colleagues insisted that Comey should pack his things and go. However, a year later, the same person insisted that James Comey's firing suggests an attempt to squelch an investigation in an effort to cover up wrongdoing. Lastly, on October 31, 2016, a third Judiciary Committee Democrat stated that Comey's actions make it clear he should resign immediately for the good of the FBI and the Justice Department. Fast forward a year, and the same Democrat is then advocating for Director Comey to receive, get this, the Profiles in Courage Award following his termination. So to clear up the apparent confusion among my colleagues, do you believe the termination of former FBI Director James Comey was justified following your recent findings that describe Comey as insubordinate in his handling of Hillary Clinton's email investigation?
Mr. Chairman, as Inspector General, my responsibility is to get the evidence and the facts, and it is then up to others to decide what the appropriate penalty or adjudication should be of that. So I'm going to, for the reasons that we found here, that people should stay in their roles and responsibilities and understand those, I'm going to...
You would agree, however, that insubordination in the matters that you outlined in your report is a serious matter.
Oh, I agree. It's a serious matter.
So on page 147 of your report, there is a text exchange that I'm curious about. About halfway down the page, Agent 1 stated he could not recall anything specific to add to this exchange. In another exchange on February 4, 2016, Agent 1 and an FBI employee who was not assigned to the mid-year investigation discussed Agent 1's interview with a witness who assisted the Clintons at their Chappaqua, New York residence. Part of this exchange follows. FBI employee, boom, how did the witness go? Agent 1, awesome, lied his ass off, went from never inside the SCIF, sensitive compartmented information facility, at residence, to looked in when it was being constructed, to remove the trash twice, to troubleshot the secure fax with HRC a couple of times, to every time there was a secure fax, I did it with HRC. Ridic, end quotes. FBI employee, would be funny if he was the only guy charged in this deal. Agent 1, I know, for 1001. Now that's referring to 18 USC 1001, is it not?
That's correct.
All right. Even if he said the truth and didn't have a clearance when handling the secure fax, ain't no one gonna do S blank blank blank. Now, we asked Agent 1 about the implication in this message, this is your report, that no one would be charged irrespective of what the team found. And Agent 1 stated, yeah, I don't think I can say there's a specific person that I worked with in this case that wouldn't charge him for that. Wouldn't charge him for that. I think it's a general complaint of, you know, of FBI agents that are kind of being emotional and complaining that no one is going to do something about something. So, but there's nothing specific that I can tell you. Now, this individual, Agent 1, is expressing the opinion that was a circumstance under which charging somebody would be appropriate. Is that correct?
That's certainly what he's suggesting here.
All right. Now, what is Title 18, Section 1001? What
That's
is that
making
violate?
a false statement to a government official in the course of an review or investigation.
So is that not exactly the same statute under which Mr. Papadopoulos and Mr. Flynn were charged?
I don't know
by the
specifically,
special
but I
counsel?
assume so.
All right. Thank you. Those are all the questions I have, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes. First of all, let me state before I ask questions of Mr. Horowitz that the President told us why he fired Mr. Comey, and it wasn't for any of the things mentioned in the report. It was because of the Russia investigation. He told that to us on NBC News in an interview with Lester Holt. I believe the President, unless there's evidence he was lying, but I haven't heard any suggestions of that. Now, Mr. Horowitz, the special counsel's investigation has resulted in 5 guilty pleas and 23 indictments so far. Do any of your report's findings call into question any of these serious criminal indictments?
Our report focused on the Clinton email investigation.
No, it has nothing to do with it.
It focused on the Clinton email investigation.
So the answer is no, it has nothing to do with it.
The only place we touch on Russia is that October time
Thank
period.
you. On May 2nd, 2017, President Trump tweeted, FBI Director Comey was the best thing that ever happened to Hillary and that he gave her a free pass for many bad deeds, unquote. Over the course of your investigation, did you find that the FBI gave Hillary Clinton, quote, a free pass for many bad deeds, unquote?
I'm sorry, could you restate that, Congressman?
Did you find that the FBI gave Hillary Clinton, quote, a free pass for many bad deeds, unquote?
I think we've laid out here quite clearly what the investigative steps were and how the decision was made. So 500 pages worth of information here to make that assessment.
In fact, you found, did you not, that the specific investigative decisions that you reviewed, quote, were based on the prosecutor's assessments of the facts, the law, and the department practice, close quote.
Correct.
On July 22nd, 2017, the President tweeted, quote, so many people are asking, why isn't the AG or special counsel looking looking at the many Hillary Clinton or Comey crimes, close quote. Did you uncover evidence of any crimes committed by James Comey?
I'm going to, again, rely on this report.
All right, let me rephrase the question. Does the report discuss any alleged crimes committed by James Comey?
The report does not discuss
Does not.
crimes.
And in fact, although you found reason to question Mr. Comey's judgment, you found no evidence that his actions were the, quote, the result of bias or an effort to influence the election. Is that correct?
That's correct.
It's correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. On September 1st, 2017, the President tweeted, quote, wow, looks like James Comey exonerated Hillary Clinton long before the investigation was over, and so much more. A rigged system, close quote. Did you uncover any evidence supporting President Trump's assertion that Mr. Comey prejudged or, quote, rigged the outcome of the investigation?
Again, I'm going to rely on what's here. I can only speak to what we
Okay,
have
then let me
in
rephrase
terms
the
of-
question.
Well,
Did the report note any evidence of that?
we've got the May drafting of the statement, which some people have raised concerns about. I'm not going to sort of extrapolate beyond the facts here, but I think there is that information about the drafting of the statement back in May.
And your office reviewed evidence that showed Director Comey resisted acknowledging the existence of the Russia investigation in October 2016 because he wanted to avoid taking action that might influence the election. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And he wanted to be fair to then-candidate Trump.
I don't know what his
Well, I
mental
think,
state was
I
other
think
than
it can be
following
fairly
the rules.
stated that if the FBI acknowledged an investigation into the Trump campaign, that might not have been inured to Trump's benefit, and therefore being fair to Trump may not.
I understand. I'm just
Okay.
saying he explained
Fine.
in here what his rationale
On
was for
December
why he did what he
3rd,
did.
2017, the President tweeted, quote, after years of Comey, with the phony and dishonest Clinton investigation and more, running the FBI, its reputation is in tatters, worst in history. Close quote. Did your investigation uncover any evidence that the Clinton investigation was, quote, phony and dishonest?
Again, I'm going to rely here. We found that the prosecutors made the judgments they made based on the facts, the law, and the evidence they uncovered. We had concerns about the text messages and the implications for the investigation.
I'll take that as a no. On June 5th, 2018, the President tweeted, quote, what is taking so long with the Inspector General's report on crooked Hillary and slippery James Comey? Numerous delays. Hope report is not being changed and made weaker, close quote. Did you omit horrible things from this report or otherwise weaken it to paint Hillary Clinton, James Comey, or any other department official in a better light?
We handled this report like we did any others. No, we didn't.
Thank you. Last week, the President said that the FBI, quote, plotted against his election, close quote, and that your report shows total bias, in quotes, at the FBI against the President and in favor of Secretary Clinton. Did your investigation uncover evidence of an FBI plot against the President's election?
I think those August text messages reflect individuals suggesting that they could take action based on their beliefs.
But your report also said that they did not, in fact, that the FBI's decisions were not influenced by that.
If we're focused on mid-year, on the Clinton investigation, that's correct. That's what we found as to the decision to decline back in July.
Did your investigation find that the FBI is totally biased against President Trump?
We lay out here what we found on bias and what we did, and at least as to certain individuals, we had concerns about what their text indicated.
Okay, your report concludes that the outcome of the Clinton investigation was based on the facts and the law and not on political bias. Do you stand by that conclusion?
We stand by the conclusion in this report.
Can you explain why you reached that conclusion?
We looked at the decision to decline prosecution. We interviewed the prosecutors. We looked at their notes, their emails, the documentary evidence, and as a result of that, we did not see evidence of bias by the prosecutors, political bias I'm talking about, which is what we were looking at and looking for, and looked at the past precedents they cited as their reasons for what they did, and based on all of that information, we concluded that there wasn't evidence of political bias infecting that decision, and we describe here how they reached the decision they reached.
Thank you. Now, during the rollout of the report, your office confirmed that it continues to investigate the improper disclosure of information about the Clinton investigation to Trump campaign surrogates like Rudy Giuliani. Can you confirm that this work is ongoing?
The only thing I'll say about that is that, as we indicate here, our investigative work continues. I'm not going to speak as to what particular leak matter individuals might be part of that ongoing review.
So you can confirm, I will take that as a confirmation of the existence of a specific investigation into Mr. Giuliani's comments in the week before the election?
You shouldn't take that as any specific confirmation of anything. I'm not going to do the same thing we lay out here. It was inappropriate.
Fair enough.
As to what occurred in 2016.
What is the timeline for this work? When can we expect the next report?
We will, much like with this review, we will follow the evidence where it leads, and when it's completed, we will issue our report. We will
now,
not be shortcut
on page,
on
thank you. On page 387 of the report, I'm going to read it said, he said, it's clear to me, this is Attorney General Lynch quoting FBI Director Comey. He said, it's clear to me that there is a cadre of senior people in New York who have a deep and visceral hatred of Secretary Clinton. And he said it is deep. And he said it was surprising to him or stunning to him, close quote. Is there evidence that, in fact, there were people in the FBI office in New York who had a hatred of Secretary Clinton?
We looked at individuals connected to the mid-year review. We were not out there looking at every single FBI agent's personal devices, text messages, who had no role in the mid-year investigation.
Okay. Now, I want to get back to the Peter Strzok matter, and I'd like to discuss what appears to be the most troubling, well, let me ask first. You would agree, I take it, that there's a crucial distinction between the appearance of political bias on the part of an FBI agent or whoever, and whether any investigative actions are actually taken as a result of political bias.
There are two different issues.
Okay. I'd like to discuss, and by the way, let me ask a different question. We keep using the word bias. Mm-hmm. Is the word bias synonymous with the word political opinion, or is it used in a different sense?
No, we used it, and I'm using it in the context of political bias. In other words, you're using your personal views to impact your decisions in a way that's non-investigatory. In other words, for other reasons.
But you found that Strzok, for instance, had this bias, but that it didn't impact the investigative action. So, is that in what way is that bias, if it didn't impact the investigation, different from a political opinion, or is it the same thing?
Let me just be. We found he exhibited bias. We found decisions that were made by others were not infected by that bias. We did have concerns about how what we thought was a biased state of mind impacted his October decision regarding the Wiener laptop. I think it's important to keep them
But you couldn't
separate.
say it did or it didn't in that one.
We could not say one way or the other, but we couldn't rule it out.
Okay.
And that's a pretty significant.
Now, I'd like to discuss what appears to me the most troubling text exchange, which has already been talked about. On August 8th, 2016, Page asks, quote, Trump, actually he didn't use the word Trump, but it's clear he's referring to him, not ever going to become president, right? Right. Strzok responds, no, he won't. We'll stop it. Many have used this text as proof that Strzok actually intended to use his position at the FBI to stop Donald Trump from becoming president of the United States. But Peter Strzok did not have that kind of power. Your report found that Strzok was, quote, not the sole decision maker for any of the specific mid-year investigative decisions. Is that correct?
Pre-July 5, just to be clear. Pre-closing in July. I think it's important to keep it separate from where he could have been a decision maker in October with regard to the Wiener
Peter
laptop.
Strzok certainly knew about the Russia investigation before the election. And if he had publicly disclosed that information, he might have prevented Mr. Trump from being elected. But your investigation did not find that Mr. Strzok disclosed the details of the Russia investigation to the press before the election, did it?
No, we don't.
Okay. Your report goes on to point out that despite the appearance created by his texts, you, quote, found no evidence that in some instances Strzok and Page advocated for more aggressive, I'm sorry. You, quote, found evidence. I added the word no. You found evidence that in some instances Strzok and Page advocated for more aggressive investigative measures than did others on the mid-year team, such as the use of grand jury subpoenas and search warrants to obtain evidence. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So, in general, I think it's fair to say that the evidence does not show that, well, it shows that pre-July 5th, certainly Strzok left his bias or political opinions at home and didn't bring it to the office. And after July 5th, it doesn't show one way or the other. Is that correct?
I wouldn't go that far in terms of what our finding is pre-July 5. I would say that as the investigations we looked at, his bias, we didn't find caused those decisions. You know, as we noted, there are lots of decisions in an investigation. I can't.
So you
speak
found,
to
but
all
you
of them.
found no. You could not point a finger and say he made this decision or influenced this decision because of his bias.
That's correct.
Okay. And were there FBI agents, to your knowledge, or officials who had negative opinions of Hillary Clinton?
We have the text messages we laid out here. There are some that you could, I think, imply that. Certainly, Peter Strzok's attorneys have made that argument. We did, almost everything we found was the other way, was anti-Trump.
By Strzok and Page?
By Strzok and Page and the other three agents that we had.
The other three agents. But you didn't look at other
agents and lawyer.
But you didn't look at other agents, like in the New York office?
We did not look at agents beyond the team, the Clinton email investigation team. I am not here to tell you what
I will simply observe in conclusion that in an organization as large as the FBI, in a country that was pretty closely divided, where half the American people thought Trump was a great guy and half thought Hillary was wonderful and half thought the opposite in both cases, it would be pretty amazing if there weren't lots of people in the FBI who loved Donald Trump, and lots of people who couldn't stand him, and that there's nothing wrong with people holding their political opinions as long as they didn't let those opinions impact their jobs. Would you agree with that statement?
People are free to have their personal views, and their job is to check them at the door when they walk into work.
And I'll say one other thing. If it is true that Strzok did not impact any decision based on his personal political opinion, then expressing his political opinion to his girlfriend was wrong only because he used FBI phones?
I think it is very troubling because it undercut confidence in the investigation, as we laid out here. And as I said, I can't say definitively that his actions didn't result in action. I can only speak to the ones we looked at and the ultimate decision by the prosecutors.
They did.
There's no evidence as to those pre-July 5 ones they did. I'm very concerned about what occurred in October. And again, I go back to what I said earlier. I think, frankly, anybody should be concerned about any law enforcement officer expressing these kinds of views while they're investigating those very individuals. I don't care whether it's a presidential race or a local election, it just shouldn't happen.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chairman of New York yields back. Two quick housekeeping matters. Inspector General Horowitz, if you need to take a break for any reason or no reason, just let me know. To my colleagues, I am acutely aware that all four chairpersons went over the time limit, and I'm acutely aware of how manifestly unfair it would be for me not to allow you to do the same. Nevertheless, I will not be able to allow everyone the same amount of time because some people have July 4th plans. So I'm going to try to do a better job. What I've done in the past is if you ask a question after 5 minutes, I'll say the witness may answer, but no more questions. And I apologize. I appreciate your attendance, but I'm trying to get us out of here before Friday. With that, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, is recognized.
Mr. Horowitz, does Peter Strzok like the president?
I can only speak to what his text messages say, and they're obviously not positive comments about the president.
February and March of 2016, Peter Strzok said, Trump's abysmal, Trump's an idiot, he's a bleeping idiot, Hillary should win 100 million to 0. Sounds to me like he hates the president.
His text messages would certainly leave that as the implication.
Your report says Strzok ran the Clinton investigation on a daily basis. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
And Peter Strzok, in your report, he was the lead investigator on the Russian investigation. Is that true?
That's my understanding for the time period he was on it.
So the guy, he ran the Clinton investigation, he runs the Russian investigation, and he hates the president, but your report says while his bias cast a cloud, it didn't impact final decisions. Is that accurate?
It didn't impact the prosecutor's final decision.
Right. Let's look at a few other things Peter Strzok had to say. On May 4th, 2016, the day after President Trump secures the Republican nomination, Mr. Strzok says, now the pressure really starts to finish the Clinton investigation. I'm not sure why the pressure would be more or less the day after. It seems to me you want to just do the investigation. On July 31st, as was mentioned earlier, the FBI opens the Russian investigation. 1 week later, Peter Strzok says, I can protect my country on many levels. 2 days after that, he says, we will stop Trump. 1 week after that, he says, no way he gets elected. It's like an insurance policy. So think about this, Mr. Horowitz. Peter Strzok the FBI opens the Russia investigation on July 31st, 2016. Peter Strzok is the lead investigator. Within the next 15 days, he says, I can protect my country on many levels. No way he gets elected. We will stop him. We have an insurance policy. Now, that seems like, at least I think a lot of regular folks would interpret that as more than just casting a cloud on what the FBI ultimately did. I mean, it's one thing to say Trump's an idiot. It's another thing to say we got an insurance policy. It's one thing to say Trump's awful. It's another thing to say we're going to stop him, especially when those statements are made within 15 days, just days after you've launched an investigation into that individual. Would you agree?
And I think the important thing here is the time period we're talking about, because those messages in the July-August period, which we found extremely concerning and antithetical to core values of the FBI, concerned, as we noted, the Russia investigation, and as you noted, and that's why we had so much concern about what occurred in late September and October.
Exactly. Mr. Horowitz, was Peter Strzok put on Special Counsel Mueller's team?
He was.
So again, the guy who hates the president, the guy who ran the Clinton investigation, the guy who ran the Russian investigation, then gets assigned to the special counsel team. Do you know what date, Mr. Horowitz, the special counsel was named?
I believe it was around May 17th.
May 17th, 2017. May 17th, 2017. Mr. Horowitz, do you remember what Peter Strzok said on May 18th, 2017?
I do. It's in our report on page 405.
I unleashed it on the mid-year exam, this one?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now I need to fix it and finish it. There's unfinished business, and this could be an investigation leading to impeachment. That's what he said the day after?
Correct.
Again, don't you think that sounds and looks a little bit like, to regular Americans, a little bit more than just casting a cloud on the overall investigations?
Again, I'd go back to what the report concerned, which was the Clinton email investigation, which was concluded about a year earlier with Director Comey's announcement. But it's precisely why we were concerned about what occurred in late September and October, when Mr. Strzok had the choice between working on the Russian investigation or on the Wiener laptop Clinton investigation.
He was prioritizing one over the other.
Chose Russia.
Yeah. Let me just finish with this, and this is probably what bothers me more than all what we just went through. More than that, probably what bothers me the most is Peter Strzok's attitude. I think it's what bothers Americans the most about this whole ordeal. I just want to go to one more text message, one more thing Mr. Strzok said. This is back in that August time period again. August 26, 2016, Peter Strzok says, just went to a Southern Virginia Walmart. I can smell the Trump supporters. This is what ticks Americans off more than anything else, I'm convinced, about all this in Clinton investigation, all this Russian investigation, is this idea that there are two sets of rules or two standards. One set of rules for us regular folk who shop at Walmart, but a different set if your name is Clinton, Comey, Lynch, McCabe, or if your name is Peter Strzok. And the arrogance and the condescension and the elitist attitude, that is what ticks people off. And as they look at all this and see what Strzok said throughout these investigations, that's why their confidence is so shaken. And frankly, that's why they're so mad. And that's why we got to get some answers from Mr. Rosenstein and Mr. Wray about this whole ordeal. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Ohio yields back. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for your service. Chairman Gowdy and others have mentioned the very troubling emails that were very critical of President Trump. So my question to you, none of these emails were made public during the election, correct? That's what I read.
They were not. The text messages
were not made public during the election. And so therefore, it's fair to say that these emails did not influence the election, correct? They weren't made public, so they did not influence the election.
Yeah, I don't think these text messages at all were out there in 2016. We uncovered them in 2017.
Okay, they did not influence the election. Now the FBI conducted investigations related to both presidential candidates, but Director Comey publicly released information only about Secretary Clinton, while he kept secret information about the investigation related to the Trump campaign and the Russian government, correct?
He followed the rules on the the Russia matter. He followed the rules on the Clinton Foundation matter. He didn't follow the department's practices on
that was very troubling to me that he did not follow the protocol of the
I just
FBI.
worry when people say kept secret. He actually followed the rules.
Mr. Horowitz, in a Senate judiciary hearing the other day, one of our colleagues from the other side of the aisle, he said that your report only confirms that Hillary Clinton got kid glove treatment from the FBI. I would say the opposite is true. And as my good friend Joe Biden would say, that is total malarkey. I think that your report makes clear that the reverse is true, and that there was a fact and element within the FBI that was biased against Secretary Clinton. For example, according to your executive summary, one of the reasons cited for Mr. Comey's extraordinary October 28th letter to Congress about the discovery of additional emails on a laptop was, quote, the fear that the information would leak if the FBI failed to disclose it. And that to me is very troubling. And then it went on to say that there were selective leaks throughout the investigation on Clinton, serious errors in judgment, I quote, serious errors in judgment in the unprecedented action by the director of the FBI in the final weeks, right up next to the election of 2016 presidential race, in violation of protocol, as you mentioned. And I would say that this all worked in one direction and to the detriment of candidate Clinton and to the benefit of candidate Trump. And I would say that it may well have determined the outcome of the 2016 election. So my question to you is, what are you doing to make sure that this doesn't happen again, that it does not become politicized, that it can't influence another election?
It's a very important question, Congresswoman, and what we've done is we've made 9 recommendations in this report, one of which is precisely to that issue, that the department needs to consider putting in place some guidance and rules and policies, practices to memorialize what it believes prosecutors and agents should be doing in the time period before the election.
Well, I think that's very, very important to make sure that no future election is swayed and no collusion is overlooked because of politics pure and simple. Right. And the main question that remains and that I'd like to see a report on was, why was there a different standard on the Russian investigation, which followed protocol, but on The Clinton area, there were press conferences, there were testimony before Congress, there were statements about emails that he hadn't even read. Why was there such a difference in standards? And how can you enforce a standard? You had a standard. It wasn't enforced. It was violated. So how would you enforce the standard in the future?
So, as we describe in here, Director Comey explained what his rationale for treating the Clinton email Wiener laptop issue differently than the Russia investigation, the Clinton Foundation investigation, even the request of the intelligence community to put out a statement about it, which is described in here.
Well,
and I think what has to happen going forward, and one of the most concerning parts, or among many concerning parts of this, is Director Comey, rather than speaking with the Attorney General about it or consulting directly with them, did what he did in terms of his guidance. I think the bottom line here is the leadership of the department needs to have rules in place, policies in place, norms in place, practices in place to consider this. And when an issue like this arises, they should be able to talk to one another.
well, he violated protocol with one candidate and followed it with the other, helping President Trump and hurting the candidacy of Secretary Clinton.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the gentlelady from New York for making the case for firing Comey, making the case for why both Democrats and Republicans had very valid reasons that we wanted the President to let him go for his unprofessional and insubordinate activity, and yet once the President did it, somehow he was wrong. In your report, Mr. Horowitz, you bring out the fact that the former director was, in fact, at times unprofessional, didn't follow rules, and even insubordinate, correct?
That's correct.
So we have a reason to fire somebody. The gentlelady from New York just made the case in resounding ways, if what she believes to be true is true, that he should have been fired and fired immediately, and probably would have been fired by President Clinton had she become president. But I want to go on to two other points, and one of them is the standard for bias. Now, I'm a former, I guess I'm an employer now, but in the years that I was a manufacturer and so on, you know, the definition for most of us for a bias, if reviewing text or emails and anything close to what Strzok and Page were saying and others occurred, and we were in an EEOC or some other kind of complaint, we'd be held clearly for this to have met the requirement for any action whatsoever that was less than favorable for an employee, a termination and so on. We would be held as having a bias. Matter of fact, every member up here on the dais had to go through 90 minutes of training in which they gave us examples that for a fraction of what Page and Strzok had done, if there were any adverse action whatsoever, we'd be held as biased. How is it you can say you found no evidence of bias? What makes the standard different for the Department of Justice?
Well, let me be clear. We did not say that their words and texts and these messages were not indicative of bias. In fact, we were very concerned with them because that kind of bias and those kind of
So
views,
you found bias, but the actions,
that's the question. Right.
the famous insurance policy, the likelihood that they were in, quote, Andy's office and were plotting, conspiring to figure out a way to either keep the president from winning or hurt him, that conspiracy, that evidence of that conspiracy is not enough to be an action? Isn't a conspiracy an action separate from what you might do? If you conspire to blow up the Oklahoma City federal building, you don't have to succeed for there to be a crime. Isn't that true?
Yeah, there's a conspiracy. You don't have to actually carry it out at all. And I agree with you, the concern evident in those texts in August.
So they had a bias and they had a conspiracy to do something. We just don't know exactly what that is. Is that correct?
I'm going to put aside what they had a conspiracy to do, but I do think that what was reflected there in August translated directly for us into concerns about what occurred a month later in September.
Okay, so I see it as there's a bias, a conspiracy, and they did do some things wrong, and that came out clearly in your report. very clearly there was a reason to fire the former FBI Director Comey, and it was a bipartisan effort. I guess I would say that maybe Republicans would have objected if President Clinton had fired him, but that isn't the case. I want to ask, though, a question back to, back to Mr. Comey. Last Thursday, when you issued your report, basically 4 hours before that was issued, his op-ed came out showing that he had clearly read the report. How did he get to see the report before it was public?
So, as with all of our reviews, first of all, he did not see the whole report. But as with all of our reviews,
but he's a former member, a former person. Do all former employees get this?
So the process is, and we did this from Fast and Furious on forward to ones that never make headlines. If individuals whose conduct we criticize in a report have testified to us and voluntarily agreed to speak to us, as you know, this has been an issue that you've supported us on, getting testimonial subpoena authority. One of the
we want you to have it for former employees.
Without that authority, they have to come in voluntarily, and one of the things that we do is, if they come in voluntarily and speak to us,
so you the quid pro quo is you let him see it. Did
only
he sign
those portions of the report.
Did he sign a non-disclosure?
He did.
So when he published before it came out, he effectively breached the non-disclosure, didn't he?
The gentleman's time has expired, but you may answer the question.
I'd have to actually look at the exact timing on that, on when it came out on Thursday versus when our report came out. I frankly didn't focus on that question before.
Well, he certainly had disclosed it to the newspaper to get it published in that timing. He must have been disclosing it to newspaper personnel hours or days ahead of time, and that would seem to be a violation of that non-disclosure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Horace, thank you for your service. Let me apologize. I'm going to be wanting yes/no answers. I think some of these you have already, but because of the nature of the time, let me just repeat. Your report does not vindicate the president or conclude that the Trump campaign did not conclude with the Russians. Is that accurate?
Our report doesn't address the Russia.
Your report doesn't have anything to do with the numbers of individuals that were connected to the Trump administration of Trump campaign with Russia. You didn't deal with any of these, including the picture of Papadopoulos, who was indicted in the meeting in Trump Tower.
Our review focused on the mid-year investigation.
Thank you very much. Donald Trump is the first sitting president in history whose campaign chairman spent his time behind bars during his own presidential campaign. But none of these issues were investigated by your investigation. Is that correct?
Our review concerned the Clinton email investigation.
And then let me quickly, your report does not, excuse me, I am interested to know about Chapter 7, pages 260, 262. You cite all of the reasons for concluding that Secretary Clinton did not break the law or have any basis to conclude that she broke the law for her use of a private server. Is that accurate still?
That are the prosecutor's reasons as given to us and explained to us as our analysis.
And you didn't counter that in your report?
Correct.
Did you say that it was grounded in the law, facts, and applicable DOJ precedent?
Based on the evidence we'd reviewed, that is what we found.
With regard to the prosecutor's
And her campaign was not subject of a federal counterintelligence investigation by a nation's law enforcement, to your knowledge, or at least you didn't investigate that?
There was a review on that issue, and I could talk a little bit more about it. I'd need to tease that out just a little, Congressman.
But it did not impact the original or the basis of your report.
The finding was that there was no intrusion.
In light of what you saw, would you think it was reasonable for Americans to conclude that Secretary Clinton was a victim of a double standard in light of the information that the FBI had about the Trump administration, or excuse me, campaign, and its opening of the investigation that was not leaked?
I'm going to focus on what our conclusion was as opposed to the public's. Our conclusion was the standard that should have applied was the same one that the director applied to the Russia investigation and the Clinton Foundation investigation.
And it was not the same standard?
It was not the same standard. That was
I want to show these documents which show the leaks from the Southern District and others from the FBI. Do you find that troubling that leaks in your report went out
Just to be clear, we do not say where those are from, or we simply put in there the individual's titles, but we're very concerned, as we explained in here. We're asked to look at leaks all the time, in this matter, other matters, and if there are, as you know, multiple people who have had disclosures or contact, it makes it very hard to figure out.
Do you think they were biased toward Mrs. Clinton?
I have no idea one way or the other.
Let me move to the Strzok Page questioning that I have. On November 2016, the day after the presidential election, Lisa Page sent a quote to Peter Strzok, "Are you going to give out your calendar? Some seems kind of depressing. Maybe it should be just the first meeting of the secret society." Mr. Horace, are you familiar with that text?
I am.
On January 24, 2018, Ron Johnson went to Fox News and indicated, shouting, "It's further evidence of corruption, more bias, corruption at the highest levels, the secret society. We have an informant that was talking about a group holding secret meetings off-site. There's so much smoke and there's so much suspicion." Mr. Horace, did your report find any evidence of a secret society at the FBI?
We did not find any.
Did your report find any evidence that there was a group of the FBI holding secret meetings off-site?
I'm not sure we looked for that, but certainly part of the mid-year investigation, we didn't see.
In fact, Page explained that the calendars referenced in this text message was funny and snarky calendars of Russian President Vladimir Putin in different poses, such as holding up a kitten. Mr. Horowitz, Page and Strzok both told your investigators that secret society was used as a joke. Is that correct?
That's what they told us.
On August 15, 2016, Strzok had sent Page a text that stated, quote, "I want to believe the path you threw out for consideration in Andy's office, and there's no way he gets elected, but I'm afraid we can't take that risk. It's like an insurance policy in the unlikely event you die before you're 40. Mr. Horace, in your report, Strzok explains a reference in his text to an insurance policy, quote, reflected his conclusion that the FBI should investigate the allegations thoroughly right away as if Trump was going to win. Is that correct?
That was his explanation.
Did your report reach any conclusions that would contradict Mr. Strzok's explanation?
I think it's fair to say we had concerns about what his intentions were there.
Did any of what you came across suggested that they had a plan to undermine the election of Donald Trump?
We did not. We did not investigate, as we said here, the Russia matter. We have ongoing work in that regard. So.
And was there, in your opening statement, I think you said, the Director Comey, clearly departed from the norms and undermined the perception of fairness of the FBI. Those are my paraphrasing words. And is that in relation to his handling of former Secretary Clinton's emails, of which you found that she did not break the law based upon their report?
The gentlelady's time has expired, but you may answer the question.
Yes, Comey violated the norms, as you said. We didn't find that she didn't break the law. We found what the prosecutor's assessment was of it and determined that it was based on the facts and the law.
And that was that she did not break the law?
That was their conclusion, correct.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr.
Chairman. Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, having spent the last 2 years down the old executive office building, along with our colleague, Mr. Issa, didn't get an opportunity to hear all the other questions and the answers to those questions. So rather than repeat what a lot of others may have said, I'd like to yield to my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, my time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Horowitz, how many text messages were exchanged between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page?
I don't have an exact number, but tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands, and we got to see most of these last fall and over the last several months, but there was one we didn't get to see. One text message we didn't get to see that until last week when your report came out.
Yep.
And it just happened to be the most explosive one, the one that says, "We'll stop Trump." Mm-hmm. How come we didn't see that beforehand?
Let me explain how we ended up finding that, because I think it's important to also appreciate the.
I guess I'm more interested in if someone was trying to hide it.
Well, we uncovered it in May, so last month. We uncovered it in our fourth round of work on their on their FBI devices.
That's my question. If you uncovered it a month ago, why did we not see it until last Thursday?
I can't answer that question. We provided the
but who made the decision?
Department.
Was it Mr. Wray? Was it Mr. Rosenstein? Was it Mr. Sessions? Who made the decision?
What we have done as we found these texts is send them to the department and for them to produce it to Congress, and that's what we did in May.
And who at the department, though?
We sent it to the Office of Deputy Attorney General and.
So Mr. Rosenstein.
in his office.
Mr. Rosenstein made a decision that instead of us seeing the most explosive text message between these two key agents who were on the Clinton team, the Russia team, and on the special counsel team, he made a decision to wait a month for us to see that text message.
I can't speak to whether anyone made a conscious decision. I would just say there was, in that fourth recovery that we made in May, there was 100,000 plus lines of text to go through. All of them we'd found before. This one was one we hadn't. We didn't see it or pick it up until June.
And did you not see it, or was it hidden from you? Because we have the text message right before it and the one that happened right after it, but somehow that one, the most explosive one, was missing from the pages that we got months ago.
And I can explain how we ended up finding it, because it was missing from, we did not have it either.
So the department didn't give it to you either?
I don't think the department had it, and I can explain why I don't think they had it. These text messages were retained by the FBI pursuant to a data collection where they were pulling text messages. I'm not a tech person, I'll do my best here. They were pulling them off the FBI devices. They each had their own FBI phones. They were pulling them. As we got these texts and found these concerning messages in 2017, we then asked the FBI for all their text messages. When we got all their text messages, as you know, we found a window, a period of several months where it was 0. We then went and got their phones and said, okay, if the FBI isn't collecting them, we're going to try and extract them from the phones. We did a first run through using our cyber forensics capabilities, collected material. We then went to our outside vendor that we used to see what else that contractor had. We did another go round with some additional tools, found more. We then went to the Defense Department.
Okay.
Did the same thing.
Yeah, I'm thankful that Mr. Shabba yielded me time, but I got the gist of it. You had to jump through all kinds of hoops to retrieve it.
Correct.
The point is, when you did get it, Mr. Rosenstein decided we couldn't get it until your report came out. He sat on it for a month of time.
I can't speak to how they...
Well, it's not the first time Mr. Rosenstein has kept us from getting information. I mean, he's hid information from us. He redacted all kinds of important conversations between Strzok and Page. He redacted that from us. We had to go over to the Justice Department and find it. So this wouldn't be the first time he hasn't given us information, frankly, I think we're entitled to. I want to well, I got 30 seconds. I don't have time to get into another subject area here. Mr. Horowitz, I appreciate that, but I do think it's interesting that you had it, you discovered it, and we couldn't get it right away. Like all the other text messages, we had to wait until the final report. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, if there's a bottom line to your report, it appears to be that while there were mistakes made, the mistakes that have been discussed, that the Clinton email, that the investigation itself was not politically motivated. Is that a fair rendition?
I think what I would say about the final decision by the prosecutors is that we found their decision was not based on political bias, but on their assessment of the facts of the law and the precedent.
Now, and that, of course, in spite of what has been made at this hearing by some of my colleagues about Mr. Strzok's testimony. You know, if one hears that testimony, it could sound like a textbook example of bias. So could you explain why, notwithstanding the renditions we've heard of his virtual on the record, because it's been quoted, bias, nevertheless, the investigation itself was not biased, given the leading role he played in the investigation?
What we found was, with regard to the specific decisions we looked at pre-July 5, that there were other team members involved. In some of those, he and Ms. Page took a more aggressive view than the prosecutors. In some of those instances, or many of those instances, actually, it was the prosecutors who were making the decision, not the agents. And so when we looked at the notes, the emails, the other evidence we could find, and the testimony we got, We concluded that there wasn't evidence of bias in how those decisions were actually made or carried out, the specific ones we looked at.
Notwithstanding Strzok's involvement, there were a sufficient number of other investigators so that the bottom line here of no political motivation stands as far as you're concerned.
As to the specific decisions we looked at, correct. And as to the prosecutorial decision for the reasons I indicated.
Now, there's a lot of concern about Mr. Comey's speaking out. He used words like extremely careless, and he has been criticized for after the case was closed, speaking out again. Yet your report said, and here I'm quoting, sir, the problem originated with Comey's elevation of maximal transparency. I tell you, sir, if someone said, Eleanor, to me, you're being maximally transparent, especially as a member of Congress, I would take that as a compliment. So I need to understand your use of that word rather than perhaps a more critical use of language.
Well, that was Mr. Comey's explanation to us as to why he did it. I will say, as inspectors general, as you know, we stand for
I was quoting the OIG report, found the problem originated with Comey's elevation of maximal transparency as overriding this case. That is to say, overriding the principle that you got to stay silent.
Correct.
If you are the FBI.
Correct. If look, we are as IGs for government transparency in all ways possible, but there are places where there are other rules like classified material, like ongoing criminal investigations. For the reason we said, individuals' reputation should not be tarnished if they're not going to be charged with a crime. So and that's a rule.
So he went beyond. His transparency is not what you're recommending to members of Congress.
Correct.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your testimony, Mr. Horowitz. It's been a busy week for you this week. And I'd like to turn to the question of how many emails were exchanged on the unsecured server between Hillary Rodham Clinton and President Barack Obama?
I don't know the exact number. We can go back and look. We understood he was one of 13 individuals in that.
Do you have any sense of the volume that was exchanged between the Secretary of State and the President?
I can get back to you on that. I'd have to refresh my recollection on that one.
At this point, you don't have a sense of that volume.
I just don't.
And then, do you have the information or a sense of were those emails secret, top secret, classified?
My recollection is, as I sit here, that they were not among the classified material, but I'm not certain of that. So I need to go back and double check that.
And I want to ask you formally that you produce those records for us. I think it's essential that this committee understand those facts surrounding that, and I'll get to that hopefully in a moment. Could you point out to us your first encounter with the replacement of the words from the statute in 793, gross negligence, with the words extreme carelessness, the first encounter with that switch?
That was back in May as the drafts were, the Comey statement, as the drafts were evolving into June.
And were the fingerprints of Peter Strzok on that exchange?
Yes.
Anyone else's fingerprints on that exchange?
I believe Ms. Page as well.
And what about James Comey? Had he
was very much in the middle of the drafting that was going on.
The three of them were in communication and drafting that, so it'd be hard to identify exactly who inserted it the first time. Is that a fair analysis?
I think we actually do have some idea of how it got changed and who put it in, but not necessarily because it was their decision as opposed to who was the sort of scribe on it as opposed to the decision maker.
I would like a little bit more information on that, too, if you could, Mr. Horowitz.
Yes.
And so while we're searching back for the genesis of extreme carelessness as a replacement for the statutory language of gross negligence, could you inform the committee here as to the genesis of the word intent as it found its way into this dialogue?
So it looks like in a variety of discussions with the team and the prosecutors, the investigative team from the FBI and the prosecutors, that the focus was on, in a significant way, there were other factors as well here, but in a significant way, the focus was on the fact that the classified material that was transiting through the email server was not clearly marked as you're supposed to have it marked, with banners saying it is classified and what level it's classified at.
More clarify my question,
Yep.
actually the insertion of the word intent as a condition to a violation of 793, when did that word first find itself in the dialogue that you looked at?
That is in the dialogue months earlier, well before the investigation reached its conclusion.
About when would you guess that is, the months earlier?
I'd have to,
In 2016?
It's in 2016.
Not in 2015?
I'm not sure whether it went back that far, although frankly it could have, because there's some indication that early on people thought that it was unlikely
Mr.
to be the
Horowitz,
case.
let me assert that the evidence I'm looking at suggests that President Barack Obama spoke that word into law. And the taped program, October 10th of 2015, he said Hillary Clinton was careless but not intentional. That program was aired on October 11th, CBS 60 Minutes. And I have the article printed in the New York Times. That's dated the 16th of October, the article that references the October 11th, where it says in this article, quote, Mr. Obama said he had no impression that Mrs. Clinton had purposely tried, quote, to hide something or to squirrel away information, close quote. Continuing, in doing so, Mr. Obama spoke directly to a core component of the law used against Mr. Petraeus, intent, and said he did not think it applied in Mrs. Clinton's case. So I'm going to suggest that the president suggested that language through the open medium and spoke the word into the law, that it require intent, which shows up throughout in the following months, in particular in James Comey's July 5th, 2016 exoneration, well, let's say a summary of the prosecution / exoneration statement, 6 times that word intent. And I find it no place else. Would you have any comments on your thoughts of how that might have been, the genesis might have gone back to the President of the United States on that idea?
I don't know that that was necessarily the genesis. We don't have evidence of that. But we do have in here, as you noted, references to the statements made by President Obama and by his press secretary and the concerns that those raised and the issues that, and how it was viewed and perceived by the team, by the investigative team.
My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. I yield back the balance.
Gentleman from Iowa yields back. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Horowitz, thank you for this report. It lays out in clear and unequivocal terms a conclusion that Republicans have resisted for years. The investigation into Secretary Clinton's emails and the decision to decline prosecution were both done properly without bias. In this report, you concluded, quote, we did not find documentary or testimonial evidence that improper considerations, including political bias, directly affected the specific investigative decisions, or that the justification offered for these decisions were pretextual. Is that right?
That's correct.
Republican members have repeatedly declared that the investigation was illegitimate and have questioned many aspects of that investigation, from the Justice Department's use of immunity agreements to the timing of James Comey drafting process. Did you investigate these allegations?
The questions of, I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Republican members repeatedly declared that the investigation was illegitimate and questioned many aspects of the investigation, from the Justice Department's use of immunity agreements to the timing of James Comey drafting process. Did you investigate these allegations? Yes. In response to your report, Chairman Gowdy wrote, quote, this report confirms investigative decisions made by the FBI during this investigation were unprecedented and deviated from traditional investigative procedures in favor of a much more permissive and voluntary approach. Chairman Goodlatte similarly, quote, wrote, quote, the Justice Department and FBI didn't treat her like any other criminal suspect and didn't follow standard investigative procedures. This doesn't seem to reflect your report's findings to me. In fact, your report explicitly states, and I quote, contrary to public perception, the mid-year team used compulsory process in the mid-year investigation. Your report also stated, quote, "We found that during these specific decisions were the result of discretionary judgments made during the course of an investigation by the mid-year agents and prosecutors, and that these judgment calls were not unreasonable." Is that right?
That's correct.
The report also concluded, quote, "We found no evidence that the conclusions by the department prosecutors were affected by bias or other improper considerations. Rather, we determined that they were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practice." Is that correct?
As to the prosecutorial decision, yes, that's correct.
Mr. Horowitz, I appreciate you being here today. I do want to ask you a couple of other questions. On June 29th, Democrats on this committee and the House Judiciary Committee sent you a letter raising concerns that Attorney General Sessions may have violated his recusal when he participated directly and personally in President Trump's decision to fire FBI Director James Comey. You testified last November that you had not made a decision, but that you were holding off while Special Prosecutor Mueller has an ongoing investigation. But you also said you would revisit your decision if new information came to light. Is this an accurate description?
Yes.
It now appears that Attorney General's violation of his recusal impacts issues well beyond the scope of the special counsel's probe. On November 13th, the Department of Justice sent a letter stating that the Attorney General has been directly involved in decisions regarding the appointment of a special counselor to investigate, and I quote, "the sale of Uranium One, alleged unlawful dealings related to the Clinton Foundation and other matters." This letter says that the Attorney General, and I quote, "directed senior federal prosecutors to evaluate whether a special counsel should be appointed and told those prosecutors to report their findings, quote, directly to the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General." Representative Raskin asked you about that letter, and you said you would receive and review this additional information. On November 30th, Ranking Member Cummings followed up and sent you a letter providing this additional information and again requesting you to conduct this review. On December 12th, you responded with a letter that said, and I quote, "Your letter asked the OIG to conduct an investigation separate from that of the special counsel." Do you have any update to provide at this time?
I don't, and I stand by what I said earlier. I think it's important for us as an OIG to consider what other investigative activities ongoing out there and consider that, keep that in mind as we're deciding when would be an appropriate time to make a determination whether to go forward with a review.
The report your office issued last week that is the subject of today's hearing discusses text messages sent by FBI employees who previously were working on the special counsel's investigation. Can you explain why in that instance you were willing to conduct a review related to the special counsel's investigation, but you will not review the Attorney General's potentially ongoing violations of his recusal agreement?
Certainly. So when we undertook this review and started finding the problematic text messages back in 2017, and ultimately gathered the evidence we gathered in July of 2017, and then met with the Deputy Attorney General and the Special Counsel to inform them of what we had found, because at the time Mr. Strzok was working for the Special Counsel. I also discussed the matter with the Special Counsel about what we believed was our need to collect all of the text messages from those individuals, even beyond the Clinton email investigation, so that we could make an assessment of how their views and their conduct impacted the Clinton email investigation.
Thank you. I believe that you could review today whether the Attorney General is violating his recusal when he participates in matters that are unrelated to the Special Counsel's investigation. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady from California yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to my friend, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Horowitz, I want to go back to where we were just a few minutes ago. This text message that this mysterious one that was the most explosive one disappeared, refound, but the department sits on it for a month. Can we get a copy of the correspondence that you had with Mr. Rosenstein? Was there any type of, how did you communicate to the Justice Department that you had found this text message?
My agent sent it by email.
So you sent an email. Did you get
this printout, the spreadsheets, of all the text? We had 120,000 or so, 100,000 lines of text.
So you didn't specify we found this one that had been missing?
I then, when we found it, I specified to the Associate Deputy Attorney General on June 8 that he ought to look at this one.
Oh, so you sent it to him last month, but then you specifically pointed out to him last week or 2 weeks ago.
Correct. When we identified it and saw it as we were going through these 100,000.
What response did he give you when you pointed it out? The most explosive text message.
Thank you for telling me about it.
Thank you for telling me that. Well, yeah, I think so. But not like, well, we need to get this to Congress like we did all the others right away?
I'd engage him on that.
Do you know if there's anything nefarious at work? Because when we got the original pages of the text, it had the prompting question from Ms. Page. It says he's not ever going to become president, right? We had that one. We've had it for months, as did you. So why didn't we get the response? All the other times we get the back and forth. This time we did it.
I think actually it goes to the technological issue that we think needs to get addressed and fixed, frankly, because what happened here is on the fourth go-round, when we were doing our quality control check on what we had done, we found an operating system or program in the phone that was...
So you think it was technical? You think it was a technical problem?
To us, that's what it appears as to why this wasn't found before May.
I'm more concerned about why Mr. Rosenstein didn't give us the information when he first got it. It seems to me he should have. Let me go to something else here. How many different investigations do you have going on right now? You're looking at Mr. Comey. You're looking at FISA, potential abuse of the FISA court process. And are you looking at the leak issue with the FBI? Have you got 3 other ones going on?
We got lots of investigations.
Well, I know, but relative to this subject, I know you got lots.
Yes, we're looking at the leak issue as well. That's ongoing.
So all 3 of those
remain ongoing.
Within ongoing investigations, right?
Yeah.
Do you have any idea when I'm interested in all of them, but I'm particularly interested in the FISA, potential abuse of the FISA process. Do you have any idea when that one will be complete?
I don't, Congressman. In part, as you know, a few weeks ago we were asked to broaden that and look at some additional information and issues.
Do you anticipate it taking 18 months like this Clinton investigation one did, Mr. Horowitz?
I don't anticipate it, but let me just say, if we had released this report in January, you would not have most of these text messages.
No, I understand. I mean, you got to do your work, but
I can't.
As important as it is,
that.
when you looking at the FISA potential abuse of the FISA process, will you be looking at the question of whether Mr. Rosenstein threatened staff members on the House Intelligence Committee?
I've read about that recently, and I'm certainly, as in all instances, available to take information. I only know at this point what I've read from the newspaper.
Will that be within the parameters of your investigation? That question?
Frankly, I'd have to understand a little bit more about it and what occurred, and how it might connect to this, if at all, or whether it's something separate.
Will you look at the issue of why, when the dossier was taken to the FISA court, they didn't tell the court who paid for the document? Will you look at that question?
Certainly within the FISA review.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman. Parliamentary
Mr.
inquiry.
Horowitz, in the course of your investigation, will you look at the question of why, when the application was taken to the FISA court, they didn't reveal the fact that the author of the document, the author of the dossier...
Chairman, I have a parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman from Ohio controls the time.
Is it not appropriate to raise the question as to what is the germaneness of the gentleman's line of questioning and whether or not we're dealing with the report of Mr. Horowitz or we're dealing with the Republicans' attempt to undermine the Mueller investigation and as well to fire Attorney General Rosenstein, which they're planning to do on Friday.
The gentlelady has not stated a parliamentary inquiry. The gentleman from Ohio controls the time, and I would ask that the time be put back on the clock that was usurped by the gentlelady from Texas.
I would just respond, Mr. Chairman. It's been widely understood that when the dossier was taken to the FISA court to get a secret warrant to spy on a fellow American citizen, they didn't tell the court 2 important facts. They didn't tell the court who paid for the document. They didn't tell the court the guy who wrote it had been fired by the FBI. And I'm just asking, as Mr. Horowitz undergoes this important investigation, if he'll be examining those 2 fundamental questions.
We will take under advisement those and other questions that have been raised. And as we said with this review, if we find additional issues, we will look at those as well. And partly that's why.
One last question, if I could, Mr. Horowitz. When May 17th, 2017, Rod Rosenstein writes a memo outlining the scope and parameters of the special counsel investigation. On August 2nd, 2017, he writes another memo that in some way alters, amends, modifies the initial scope of the investigation. and yet we can't see that, the American people can't see that. Seems to me, if you're altering the scope of an investigation into the guy that the American people made president of the United States, we as Americans deserve to know exactly the parameters and scope of that investigation. And so will you be able to get a hold of that August 2nd memo and make that available in the course of your investigation?
Gentleman's time has expired, but you may answer the question.
I'd have to think about how that connected to our investigation and what connectivity, germaneness it would have to ours. I'm happy to consider it. I have not seen either of those memos myself, and like I said, on its face, I'm not sure the connection between that and the FISA, but I'll certainly take it under advisement, Congressman.
Thank the gentleman.
Gentleman yields back. For planning purposes, we will plan to break at 1 o'clock, if that's okay with the Inspector General.
Fine with me.
With that, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And here's where I see where we are. A presidential candidate was targeted by Russian intelligence. Members of Congress, including myself, were targeted as well. And at least 21 states had their voter information penetrated by Russian intelligence. That information obtained by the Russians was weaponized with the clear intention to harm Hillary Clinton and support the election of Donald Trump. Time will tell when Special Counsel Mueller issues his report whether or not the president's campaign actively colluded with the Russians. Now, Mr. Horowitz, thank you for being here. On February the 2nd, 2018, the president tweeted, and I quote, "The top leadership and investigators of the FBI and the Justice Department have politicized the sacred investigative process in favor of Democrats and against Republicans, something which would have been unthinkable just a short time ago," end of quote. This is an accusation that has been repeated by multiple Republican members, including Representative Jim Jordan, who stated in an interview about your report, and I quote, "I think one of the big takeaways is the exact same people who ran the Clinton investigation, who had a bias in favor of Clinton, who did all of these things that are not the typical practice when you're doing an investigation. Those same people took over and ran the Russian investigation." You know, these are serious allegations, and I'd like to address them head on. Mr. Horowitz, did you find any evidence that James Comey took any investigative actions in the Clinton matter based on political bias and, quote, in favor of Democrats and against Republicans?
We did not find evidence that Mr. Comey had acted out of political bias.
And your investigation uncovered 5 FBI employees who had exchanged texts or instant messages reflecting strong personal political views, but you found that even those individuals did not let their personal political views determine the outcomes of the Clinton matter. Your report states, and I quote, "Our review did not find documentary or testimonial evidence directly connecting the political views these employees expressed in their text message and instant messages to the specific investigative decisions reviewed." And you also quote, "In some instances, Strzok and Page advocated for more aggressive investigative measures in the mid-year investigation, such as the use of grand jury subpoenas and search warrants." Did you find that there is a pro-Democrat or anti-Republican conspiracy at the FBI or Justice Department?
We didn't reach the question of whether there was a conspiracy or not. We've just laid out here what the text messages indicated, and as you noted, the fact that the specific decisions we reviewed, we found weren't impacted or affected or resulted from political bias.
I see. Do you know if the Office of Professional Responsibility is taking any actions on the subjects that you have on the people in this?
Director Ray testified yesterday that he had provided our information and report to the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility.
I see. Thank you so much for your responses. And at this time, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield my remaining time to the gentlewoman from Texas.
Gentlelady is recognized for 33 seconds.
Mr. Director, Mr. Horowitz, did you investigate any questions about Mr. Rosenstein's actions in your report as it relates to any inappropriate behavior?
No.
I didn't hear you, sir.
No.
And did you, let us finish the question that I had dealing with the FBI agents in the Southern District of New York. You did confirm that they leaked. Is that not correct?
We did not say anything at all about whether they leaked or didn't leak. We're not speaking or speak at all to who we were looking at or what we're looking at, other than we're looking at the issues we were asked to look at about investigative leaks.
And so you will continue that investigation?
We will.
All right. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Goldman, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, there has been a massive amount of bias documented by you in your investigation. You've concluded with recommendations that appear to just be more policies of the same policies with the FBI, the DOJ already had. You understood it was already against FBI and DOJ policy to let bias come into play in these investigations, correct?
Absolutely.
Well, you made references in your report, even quoted from unnamed but numbered prosecutors and agents. Have you given us the names of those individuals?
So we have a request for them, and we are...
So you haven't given us the names, and now you can't decide whether you're going to give them to us?
No, well, let me be clear. We engaged the committee on this. We went to the FBI. The FBI raised the concern.
The answer is no, you haven't given them to us. So let me just tell you, we're here because prosecutors and agents at the DOJ have been biased, and it may have, and some of us believe you've laid out a case that bias did affect what was going on, and then you come in here and say, we're going to number these people. We're not going to let you know who they are. But let me ask you this. Have you checked to see what normally wouldn't matter, how they voted in a presidential election, except when you're investigating a nominee or a president? Do you know how they voted? Did they donate money to either of the candidates?
I have no idea how they voted, and I don't have an idea.
You're bringing this investigation in here based on and are utilizing opinions and information provided by prosecutors and agents who may be just as biased as the people that we're investigating. We just don't know because we hadn't seen their texts, we hadn't seen their emails. Normally, if putting back on my my felony judge hat, if a jury is going to make a decision on guilt or innocence of a felony of say, a presidential nominee, I'm going to let them ask the jury panel, did you vote for this person? Did you give money to this person? Did you have a bumper sticker for this person? Did you put a sign in their yard? Did you talk this person up? And yet you're coming in here, you don't know if these people you were relying on actually had any biases like the very ones you were investigating. Well, let me ask you this. Among the supervising special agents you referenced and the prosecutors, do you have any idea of the percentage that may have voted for Hillary Clinton?
We did not ask people who
Well, let me tell you, I know my friend Mr. Nadler had referenced that, a big organization like that's probably just as many people supported Trump. When I heard Newt Gingrich yesterday said the fact is 97% of the people in the DOJ that donated to Democrats. 97%. So there's a good chance that the people that you're relying on did support Hillary Clinton. We don't know because you haven't asked. It's important to know who the investigators are and the people you're relying on. you mentioned in here in the report about Strzok and the relationship that he mentions with Judge Contreras. Do you know why Judge Contreras was recused, was removed from the Mike Flynn case?
I don't know why he was recused.
Or is that something you would investigate?
It's not within the scope of this investigation, as it.
Well, I'm going to reinforce the request for the identities of the supervising special agent, the prosecutors and agents that were only identified by numbers, and ask who they contributed to, if anyone, in the last 2 cycles. Now, in your report, you said the SSA told us that the FBI did not consider Pagliano as a subject or someone to prosecute in connection, but this guy set up the unsecured server, as I understood it. This is a guy that you had a lay-down case, or the DOJ did, and yet they don't use that leverage. They don't treat him like they did Manafort or any of these other people. The DOJ had leverage, and this is where bias came into play. They didn't go after him. You said the SSA told us he believed Combetta should have been charged with false statements, yet nobody charged him. And why? Because bias played a role. I understand when you have an investigation, you like to give a little something to both sides, makes you feel good. You gave us hundreds of pages of bias, but the conclusion was just, I'm sorry, whether it was subconscious or conscious, you had a little throwaway to go to the Democrats. But the fact is, bias is all the way through this, and I'm sorry that you were not able to see that with what is very obvious from your evidence. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, is recognized. Would you like to respond, Mr. Horowitz?
Can I just finish on the identity issue, just so the record's clear on that? We were asked to when we write a report, we obviously comply with the Privacy Act and the other laws Congress has in place on who we can speak to and who we can't. That's the first step we do here. Much like what we lay out here with the criticisms of folks who didn't follow the rules and the norms and law, we followed that. We then got the committee's request, consistent with our support for transparency. We would be supportive of getting the committee that information. The FBI interposed an objection because these individuals work on and have worked on counterintelligence matters, that there might be a security or safety issue. That's what we've talked to the committee about. We're happy to facilitate that issue with the committee and the FBI, but that's the objection was raised, what's today, Tuesday? Monday, I think it was, by the FBI.
Mr. Chairman, to clarify my request, it was not for anything to do with any counterintelligence. Don't want to know anything about that, just who worked on this matter.
But I think the request is clear and his response is clear. We're going to go to the gentleman from New York, and then we're going to go to the gentleman from Montana, and then we will break Inspector General Horowitz just so people can know what we're doing. My friend from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, we live in a democracy, not an authoritarian state. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in your view, is it generally appropriate to begin to ask American citizens how they voted in a presidential election or in any election for that matter?
In my view, that's not a question we should be asking, certainly from my standpoint.
Okay, thank you. The special counsel's investigation into possible Russian interference with the 2016 election has resulted in 23 indictments, correct?
I don't know, actually.
20 individuals have been indicted in connection with that investigation.
I'll accept your representation.
Okay, 3 corporate entities have been indicted in connection with the special counsel's investigation, correct?
And I don't know as I'm sitting here, but I'll certainly accept your representation.
Special counsel's investigation into possible Russian collusion identified 75 different criminal acts, correct?
Same answer.
There have been 5 guilty pleas, true?
Same answer.
Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, has been charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States, correct?
Same answer. I believe that's correct.
And Paul Manafort is now sitting in jail, correct?
That is correct.
And that's in connection with alleged witness tampering, true?
That's what I've read.
And Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, has pled guilty to lying to the FBI, correct?
That's my understanding.
His deputy campaign manager, Rick Gates, has been indicted on conspiracy to defraud the United States, true?
Again, I would accept your representation.
Okay, and George Papadopoulos, a former Trump campaign national security advisor, has pled guilty to lying to the FBI about his contacts with Russians during the campaign, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Now, former FBI Director James Comey initiated the criminal investigation into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, correct?
I'm not sure who and precisely how it was opened.
Okay, but he was FBI Director at the time, true?
He was the FBI Director at the time.
And James Comey's a lifelong Republican, correct?
That I don't know.
Bob Mueller is the special counsel leading the criminal investigation into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, true?
He is now the special counsel, correct?
And special counsel Bob Mueller is a well-respected law enforcement professional, correct?
I'll speak for myself. I have respect for him.
He's a man of integrity, true?
That's my opinion.
And special counsel Bob Mueller is a lifelong Republican, correct?
That I don't know.
Now, Rod Rosenstein is the Justice Department's Deputy Attorney General, correct?
Correct.
And in that capacity, the Deputy Attorney General oversees the special counsel's criminal investigation into the Trump campaign, correct?
That's my understanding.
Now, Donald Trump, the Republican president, appointed Rod Rosenstein to that position of Deputy AG, true?
Correct.
And Rod Rosenstein is a registered Republican, correct?
That I don't know.
Christopher Wray is the current FBI director, correct?
Correct.
He was appointed to that position by Donald Trump, true?
Correct.
And in that capacity, the FBI director helps lead the criminal investigation into the Trump campaign, correct?
I'm actually not sure of that with the special counsel, how that plays out.
Okay, we think that he's involved. FBI Director Christopher Wray is a registered Republican, correct?
That I don't know.
For the last few hours, we've sat in this hearing, and some of my colleagues, part of the cover-up caucus, have attempted to peddle conspiracy theories that the investigation into the Trump campaign's potential criminality, where we were attacked by a hostile foreign power, is a witch hunt. There is not a scintilla of evidence that a witch hunt exists right now. In fact, if any individual connected to the 2016 presidential campaign was victimized by prosecutorial misconduct, her name was Hillary Clinton. The report that you've produced, 500-plus pages, makes clear that the former FBI director violated Department of Justice protocol on multiple occasions, most severely in July of 2016 with a public explanation of Hillary Clinton's conduct, recklessly calling it extremely careless, violating DOJ protocol, and then, of course, again, in October of 2016 with 11 days prior to the presidential campaign. What are you guys complaining about? You know what happened. James Comey decided to play judge, jury, and executioner, and on October 28th, he executed the Hillary Clinton campaign, killed her in Pennsylvania, killed her in Michigan, killed her in Wisconsin, and handed Donald Trump the presidency, and at the same time, decided to pardon the Trump campaign in a court of public opinion by refusing to confirm the public the investigation that was taking place in the Trump campaign. It's a phony, fraudulent, and fake argument. Stop peddling lies about a so-called Democratic witch hunt to the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from Montana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, over here.
Sorry.
All the way there.
Sorry about that.
I appreciate the work you've done and continue to do on your ongoing investigations. I'd like to focus my short time with you on the improper interactions and leaking of information to the media.
Mm-hmm.
On page 19 of your report, you state that the FBI policy and regulations forbid the confirmation or denial and any discussion of an active investigation except in limited specified circumstances. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Also, only the FBI director, deputy director, associate deputy director, and other limited staff are authorized to speak to the media. Is that
correct?
Yeah. So why does the agency have such a policy? And could you briefly describe the consequences of not following it?
The agency has a policy because leaks harm cases. They can terribly damage an ongoing criminal investigation, and they harm people's reputations. No one should want to see anybody tarnished with mud, other allegations that are never charged, never proven.
So leaks are damaging?
Leaks are damaging to people and investigation.
Okay, so on page 430 of your report, you state that the FBI policy limits employees who are authorized to speak to the media, but you found that that policy was widely ignored and that numerous FBI employees at all levels of the organization were in frequent contact with reporters. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Further, your team identified instances where FBI employees received tickets to sporting events from journalists, went on golfing outings with media representatives, were treated to drinks and meals after work with reporters, and were guests of journalists at non-public social events. Is that correct?
Correct.
Some might consider such gifts as bribes. At the very minimum, these are serious ethics violations. In Appendixes G and H, you identify over 50 FBI employees who had over 300 interactions with reporters during the period you looked at. Is that correct?
Correct.
What evidence did you find that these 300 or so interactions and outings and meals and golf tournaments were authorized and in compliance with FBI policy?
It appears that many were not. And that is precisely why I wanted to make this public. We have this work ongoing, so I can't speak to any individual matter or issue, but I thought it was critical because of our concern as we do these reports on systemic issues, that the public and policymakers and the Department of Justice and the FBI itself understand what the challenge is. When we have to look at leaks and there are that number of contacts, it makes it very, very, very challenging to figure out how
Okay,
it
so
occurred.
you noted that this leaking of information to the media was widely known within the organization and even played a role in decision making.
And that, in addition here, very concerning, correct,
Yeah.
that a number of people made decisions based on concerns over what might be leaked.
Yeah. And you note on page 429, quote, "We have profound concerns about the volume and extent of unauthorized media contacts by FBI personnel that have been uncovered during the review."
Correct.
So given the policy to limit contact with the media was very clear, knowledge of the practice of leaking was widespread, and the potential consequences great, what evidence did you find of any disciplinary action against violating employees?
Well, when leaks were in fact uncovered, there was discipline. Our concern was that the contact alone wasn't being addressed effectively, and that's where the FBI needs to focus on it, and that's what Director Wray has said publicly that he will look at.
So based on your investigation, how many people have been referred to investigation in possible code conduct violations?
I'm not sure of that number, but I can assure you that when we find contacts, even when we can't prove the leak, going forward, when we find contacts, even if we can't prove that someone actually leaked, but if they contacted in violation of policy, we will refer that to OPR for their investigation.
Okay, and at this point, how many FBI or DOJ employees have been fired for violating the leaking policy or accepting
I'd have to get back to you on that. I don't know off the top of my head.
It's very important given the extent of your findings. And finally, the real issue here is, can the American people trust that these individuals will be held accountable? And can we count on you and your organization in your role as Inspector General to assure that this kind of improper behavior does not persist?
I can, and I will say that we will, to the extent the law permits us, make public our findings when we can make them public.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Inspector General, how long of a break would you like?
Long enough to get a sandwich or a bite to eat?
Is 45 minutes enough?
Plenty of time.
Why don't we reconvene at 1:45?
Great.
With that, we're in recess.
Oh, you're next. Yeah, no, he said it was a lot, so she wasn't back. So, and they're going for some more.
Oh, yeah, probably. Well, they're really confused.
things. I like for my that are impacting the safety and security of our nation, our reputation, and whether or not we should be using tax dollars to try to figure out why the President of the United States of America, his administration, are doing things that are so un-American as to rip children and babies from the hands and the hearts of their parents and putting them in cages. We've seen in our history 2 times in particular that we should be so offended by. The first was slavery, when we ripped families apart and wouldn't let parents be parents to their children or wives to their husbands. And then during the World War, when we took Japanese Americans and we put them in internment camps. We have seen what this kind of behavior has done in the world when we saw what Germany did to the Jews. And now we're doing it in the United States of America. And I need to understand why my colleagues who've been elected to Congress to protect and preserve this Constitution, this republic, and this nation is sitting silently by while we consistently observe this un-American activity on behalf of this administration, coming from this administration, and their complicitness in this, in their silence. I want to know why we haven't used our taxpayer dollars and our responsibility here to look at the constant violations of the emoluments clause by this president and his family, and how they consistently are intermingling their desires to get richer and richer and richer with our safety and security with other nations. I want to understand why my colleagues here in this room, in this committee, in the Judiciary Committee, and even in Congress are silent as we become enemies to our friends and friends to dictators. Who are we? We are better than that. I want to say that if we were going to utilize our good time, our communication to the nation, our exploration of what's right and what's wrong, what's going on, then we've got lots of opportunities from an arrogant, dismissive Secretary of Homeland Security who has not a heart in her to a president who doesn't even read the material before him. So I am feeling very discouraged by where this committee has taken us all day long. I am very discouraged by what my colleague, Mr. Hakeem Jeffries, referred to as the antics of the cover-up caucus. And before I yield back, I just want to say that we are the people for whom this government has been organized. It is of us, by us, and for us, and the people must have the final word here. Pay attention. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized. Dr. Kozar.
It's good to see you, Mr. Horowitz. Sorry you had to hear some of the ranting and raving and people talking out of both sides of their mouth. I mean, we can bring up abortion, and oh my God, how is that not the ultimate in hypocrisy? So I'm going to take a little different tact. I want to talk about the foreign access to the Clinton email server. Mm-hmm. So what difficulties did the FBI have during the intrusion analysis process of the capacity of the servers?
Well, in terms of difficulties, what they were trying to do is understand who had intruded, if at all, and one of the challenges they had was getting the servers themselves and obviously recreating what was on the servers and what emails and evidence trafficked through it, but also the fact that foreign adversaries might not leave footprints if they did attack the server.
Right, but we didn't have all the server materials in that.
Correct.
So that leads me to my next question. So how did the FBI square its lack of the complete data with a definitive statement on whether an adversary compromised Clinton's server or system?
Well, I think, one of the issues was trying to understand Director Comey's statement where he both, in his July 5th statement, indicated that there wasn't evidence of that they had uncovered evidence of an intrusion, but they wouldn't necessarily know that either. And that was a question we had, and as we lay out here, they explained to us the steps that they took, and we questioned the individuals who were involved in the intrusion analysis.
Well, that kind of gets me back to the point. So why wouldn't you ask any and all sources like the DNI, the military, CIA, special ops, any remote centers, if they had hacked into the server during this time? I mean, because it was offline, no one really realized what this really was. This was off, the server was here. So we could ask a number of questions in regards to that opportunity of how they looked at that server. And the reason I say that is when I asked the question last Thursday as who had looked at that server, I was told that it was an individual from the FBI. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's bothersome because once again, we saw upper echelon FBI with problems with this aspect. And I'm going to come back to another aspect here. And that is there was a megadata abnormality that happened with Mr. Strzok, and Mr. Strzok blew it off. So my point is why wouldn't we go outside the FBI to look at the servers and this data?
My understanding was there was some contact with other agencies, but I'd have to go back and just refresh myself.
I'd love to know exactly who that is and who they were, because my understanding is that there's something peculiar in that regards. There were other people that noticed something totally different than what the findings that you're showing. Okay. Now, I want to go back to this comment in regards, who told Comey that reasonably likely was the proper way to explain the results for the intrusion analysis?
I don't recall as I sit here. I'd have to go back and take a look at the report.
Do you feel that you dwelled into that issue deep enough to have a thorough conversation in that?
I think what we did was look at what the FBI did as opposed to do the intrusion analysis ourselves. Where, as an IG, Inspector General's office, we don't do an intrusion analysis. We're looking at what the FBI did to affect that.
Well, I mean, I'm going to get back to Mr. Strzok. I mean, so my understanding is he responded to the reasonably likely formation when providing edits back to Comey, did he not?
He did.
So once again, there's a common thread that we're seeing here with Mr. Strzok, not just in the parsing of words, but also in megadata anomalies, as well as looking at sources within the data. So is Strzok's edit advice to Comey not a clear example of where Strzok's bias is not publicly not too harsh on Clinton and change the public's perception on that?
Well, it's certainly a place where he weighed in and had an effect on the statement, and this had an impact on what ultimately was said publicly by Comey about whether or not there was evidence of intrusion.
Well, and I'll get back to reiterating. I'd love to know all the sources and actually have the server and these devices looked at by other groups, particularly some hotshots within DOD, DNI, to really look at this aspect, because I think there's more to the story than meets the eye. It seems to me that I'd want different validation than just the FBI. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz.
Mr. Chairman. Make a point of order.
State your point of order.
Mr. Gosar, a moment ago, ranting and raving, speaking out of both sides of her mouth. I ask that his words be taken down.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think it would do us all good to make sure that we have personalities that are not involved in this, and I think it really degrades the overall importance of this issue as we bring personalities in it, whether it be with other members or others in the administration. So I think it's important. Maybe a gentle reminder would be appropriate.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would insist either on that his words be taken down or that there be an apology.
Well, I'm not going to instruct the gentleman from Arizona to apologize any more than I am other members who today have also said things that came precipitously close to the line. I will ask the gentleman from Arizona, if I may continue. If I may continue, I will ask the gentleman from Arizona if he wishes to rephrase or restate his comments in any way, or to make clear that he wasn't directing them toward any
Chairman. I was acknowledging
colleague.
that the other side has been ranting and raving about issues that are not pertinent to today's hearing, And that's what I was confronting, not just one individual person.
So it was a general comment as opposed to one directly, specifically directed at an individual colleague? Does the gentleman from New York still wish to?
Well, as long as it's clear that he was talking in general political terms and not about an individual, okay.
I think it's pretty clear. We will now recognize the gentleman from the great state of Texas, Judge Poe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. You probably think you are in the lion's den. I don't think you are. You're handling the questions quite well. As the chairman alluded to, I'm a former judge, former prosecutor like you. In the justice system, we strive, whether we're prosecutor, defense attorney, judge, we strive for the goal of fairness. Whatever happens, whether it's a hearing on a search warrant, whether it's a criminal case, we strive for fairness. And things must not only be fair in the justice system, they got to look fair. And if they don't look fair, that's to us in the system, like you, just as bad as if it weren't fair. Prosecutors, when I was one, I had the rule, as you have, that prosecutors must seek justice, not convictions. That's our role when we were a prosecutor. Tried a lot of cases, and lawyers always wanted to know from the prospective jurors if they're biased, for or against one side. If they're biased, it's happy trails. They can't serve on the jury. So in this case, and it may not be an exact analogy, but here we have a jury taking place on a case. And we find out 5 of the jurors are biased for whoever they're investigating or hearing a criminal case. Neither side would tolerate that. They could not be involved in that proceeding. And in some cases, if we're proceeding in a trial and the jury's biased in the outset, there's a mistrial. We may try it again, or it may be dismissed with prejudice, depending on the severity of the bias. But in this case, we got 2 named individuals, Page and Struck. We know who they are. We know what they've done, all of the things that you've mentioned. But there are also 3 other unnamed biased people based on your investigation, 1 lawyer and 2 other FBI agents. What are their names?
So as I mentioned earlier, Congressman, the request has come in from the committee to give the names. We went to the FBI. The FBI raised a concern because they work on counterintelligence matters. And we are working with the committee to try and get the information you've asked for to the
So the
committee.
FBI does not want their names released.
Correct.
And so the FBI makes the decision as to who those other 3 biased people are, and they say, we're not telling you because of some other internal reason on what they also work on, counterintelligence, which whatever that means to whoever's hearing it. So my point is, we let the FBI determine not to tell us who the other 3 biased people were in this 500-page investigation that we all now have. Does that seem a little odd to you? I'm just asking your opinion.
Yeah, no, and there's a legitimate request, reasonable request from the committee, and I don't think it is a final decision at this point from the FBI, or, in my view, a final decision. It's something I'm looking forward to working with the committee to try and get the answers to, because I completely understand what the interest is of the committee in getting that information.
Well, it just seems to me that in the name of fairness, we ought to know the names of those 3 people who you determined were biased in this investigation that has taken place, this 18th-month investigation that you have been working on. I think that's fairness, and I think the American public would like to know who they are. I think in this issue, changing gears a little bit to Comey, he has done a great disservice to the reputation of the FBI. I mean, when FBI agents would walk in my courtroom back in Texas, you know, the jury wanted to stand up and say the pledge because they just trusted what they were going to say. I think now those days are over because the investigation must not only be fair, it has to look fair, and it no longer looks fair as to what the FBI is doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How many years have you known Jim Comey?
He was in the U.S. Attorney's Office when I started in 1991 there. So sometime after I started in 1991, I obviously.
How many years do you think y'all worked in the same area? 8 years, 10 years?
No. He left, I think, within a year or two of my arriving to come down to Virginia to work in the U.S. Attorney's Office there. I'd have to go back and try.
And then in your position at Justice, he was at FBI, so you had.
When I became IG, a year later, he became the FBI director.
So you've known him long enough to have an idea about what his reputation for truth and veracity was among other members of his, the Justice Department and the FBI. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And what was his reputation for truth and veracity?
He had a very strong reputation.
In your report, do you ever say at any point that Jim Comey lied?
We do not.
Do you know of any time when Jim Comey has lied?
I can't think of any as I sit here.
So when President Trump said there's not a person who's told more lies in the world than Jim Comey, you would disagree with that?
I'm not going to answer what other people's views are or think. I can only speak to what my interactions with him were.
Thank
my
you.
capacities.
I know that your report basically said that Jim Comey was exceedingly careless in coming forward before the election with his reportage of the renewal of the investigation of Hillary Clinton and the laptop and Anthony Weiner. But there was no malicious intent. Is that accurate?
As to Mr. Comey, we didn't find any malicious intent.
And what he did could have possibly affected the election. You don't know that if it did or didn't, but it could have. But it could have. And he also could have gone into the Trump-Russia investigation, which could have affected the investigation, and he didn't. Is that correct?
When you say go into, I'm sorry.
He could have let the